Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Something felt off. The moment I set foot on that property, the air was too still and the tall grass surrounding the house seemed to rustle in irregular patterns as if something was moving just beneath the surface. My chest felt tight from the start, my heartbeat picking up in a steady rhythm of unease. I couldn't fully explain I'd come here alone for a straightforward task, fix a few minor issues for the acquaintance who owned the place but was living abroad. It should have been routine, just a handful of days surrounded by nature and quiet. Yet the property greeted me with a silence so weighty it felt almost accusatory. Even the wind when it blew seemed to carry more questions than answers. I tried to brush off the initial sense of unease by reminding myself that I'd been here before. Without incident, I would arrive, do my maintenance jobs, then leave simple, but the moment I parked my truck in front of the old wooden house, an involuntary shiver ran through me. A cold sweat broke on the back of my neck and I swallowed hard. Maybe it was just the sudden dip in temperature or the fact that the sky looked permanently gray as though refusing to reveal even a sliver of sun. I grabbed my bags and headed into the house, flipping on lights to push back the oppressive darkness. I remember glancing at the large windows, feeling as if something beyond the glass might be watching. There was nobody there, at least nothing I could see. The first day passed uneventfully. I inspected the plumbing, fiddled with some wiring, and took inventory of tools and supplies. The property was extensive, but my focus was mostly on the house itself. In the distance stood a large old barn, more of a rickety workshop than a barn really stocked with tools I rarely saw outside of museums or antique shops. There was an old tractor in the far corner, huge metal chains coiled on hooks, rusted sides, and wooden crates stacked precariously against the walls. Every time I glanced at that structure, I felt a subtle tug in my gut, as if that building had a heartbeat of its own, but I let it be telling myself that I'd deal with any barn-related issues later. The second night found me restless. The property's isolation, usually a source of calm for me, became unsettling when darkness fell. The only light in the house came from a single lamp in the living room and the small bedside lamp in my room. Every other corner seemed to linger in shadow. I tried reading, but the silence made every page turn echo as if I were in a cathedral. Eventually, I decided to do a quick check around the premises, thinking a walk might help clear my head outside the moon was partially obscured by clouds. My flashlight cut through the night, revealing tall grasses shifting in gentle waves. Each time I took a step, I expected to hear something scurry away, but there was only silence. The entire property felt strangely devoid of typical nocturnal life. No hooting owls, no chirping cricket. It's nothing. It was as though nature had collectively decided to hold its breath. I made my way toward the barn, more out of habit than necessity. That place always intrigued me because it was full of old tools nobody ever used. It was padlocked, not so much for security, but more to keep wild animals from wandering inside. As I approached, I noticed how the barn's rotted wood seemed to vibrate in the beam of my flashlight, but that was likely just my own trembling hand. I took a breath, inhaling the damp smell of earth and rust. My heart was pounding. Then I heard a low, soft whistle. At first I thought it must be the wind slipping through a gap in the barn structure, but the padlock in the door appeared intact, leaving no obvious space for air to produce such a sound. I swept the flashlight around the exterior, scanning for a broken board or a missing slat. Nothing. The whistle persisted, carrying a small odd melody. I didn't recognize a tune that seemed to rise and fall as though performed by someone waiting for me to follow. I felt a jolt of panic in my stomach, an immediate punch of adrenaline that made my hands shake. My breaths came in quick, shallow bursts. My first instinct was to assume someone was inside, but I had to ask myself how they got in the lock on the barn door looked undisturbed and nobody else was supposed to be on the property. I stepped closer and the whistling grew louder. It was such a human sound. Controlled, deliberate, it had a pattern, a sort of half-finished sequence that repeated every few seconds. My mind raced. If it wasn't wind, then who was making it? I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the cold metal padlock. The frigid steel against my fingers made me wince. I told myself there must be a logical explanation, maybe an odd echo of the breeze. Then I steeled myself, unlocked the barn, and someone was inside, but I had swung the door open. The whistling stopped so abruptly I could have sworn it had never existed in the first place. Inside, everything was silent, pitch black. I flicked the flashlight in wide arcs, illuminating rows of antique tools hanging like trophies. The smell of dust and aging wood overwhelmed me, and I felt a surge of anxiety that manifested as a sudden dryness in my mouth. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. There wasn't even a rat scuttling in the corners. I forced myself to step in and search behind every crate, every shelf, even inside the old tractor's cabin. It was a brief but intense check, fueled by a cocktail of dread and determination. Eventually, I found no one and nothing out of place. My pulse was thundering in my ears, and I was almost disappointed at the lack of tangible evidence, like it would have been easier to see a person lurking there than to face the alternative explanation that maybe something I couldn't categorize was playing tricks on me. I left the barn door unlocked, partly in defiance of whatever had just taunted me. I returned to the house with my heart still in my throat inside. I locked the doors and tried to calm down with some water. My hands trembled, and every noise in the house seemed exaggerated. 20 minutes passed, perhaps 30, and just as I started to settle into the uneasy comfort of the living room, I heard it again, that faint whistle, but this time it was right outside my bedroom window. The fear that gripped me in that moment felt primal, like my body went into some sort of fight. ORF flight mode before my mind could catch up. My breathing turned ragged. My throat clenched, a thin line of sweat trickled down my back, and I clenched my fists so tight my knuckles popped. I stood up slowly and approached the window. Every footstep ringing in my ears, the window looked out onto a small patch of dirt and sparse grass. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the scene. I saw nothing except the swaying shadows of the property's boundary fence, but the whistling persisted, seeming to hover just beyond the frame. For a fraction of a second, I considered pulling open the curtains entirely to look out. Yet some deep instinct made me hesitate. I eventually forced myself to check. Flinging the curtain aside, the night stared back at me. Empty. The whistling stopped. I couldn't see anyone or anything. My flashlight, which I flicked on almost frantically, revealed not a soul. There were no footprints, no rustling in the bushes, no sign of a person crouching out of sight. It was just me and the windless stillness. But that sense of being watched, of being toyed with, sank deeper into my skin. I swallowed hard and stepped away from the window, trying to regain composure. Sleep was impossible. My mind replayed the whistling over and over, dissecting every note of its fleeting melody. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to lie down, but even under the blankets, I felt exposed. Every time I closed my eyes, I had the vivid sensation of a presence standing at the window, pressing its face against the glass, patiently waiting for me to open my eyes again. Morning arrived in the form of a gray haze. I woke groggy. Feeling anything but rested, my neck and shoulders ached from tension, and my hands were clammy. Despite the cool temperature, I wandered outside to see if maybe daylight would provide some answers. The ground around the house looked undisturbed, except for one odd detail. The barn door was now closed again. I distinctly remembered leaving it open. The padlock lay in the dirt, appearing as if it had been gently placed there rather than dropped. My stomach twisted. I told myself maybe I'd forgotten to latch it, that a gust of wind had blown it shut, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been there. After I left, I decided to keep busy, hoping distraction would keep my nerves steady. I worked on small fixes, patched a leak in the roof, and tried to push thoughts of the barn out of my mind. But strange details kept surfacing. Tools in the storage shed seemed rearranged, and the air inside had grown stale, almost suffocating. Each time I glanced at the windows, I had the feeling something flickered on the edge of my peripheral vision, just a split-second presence that disappeared the moment I turned my head by lunchtime. I was jumpy, heart-pounding at the slightest sound in the late afternoon. Clouds rolled in heavy and thunder rumbled on the horizon. The atmosphere grew even more oppressive, as if the sky itself threatened to crush the land. I kept glancing at the barn, half expecting to see someone standing in its doorway when a crack of lightning illuminated the property. I thought for the briefest heartbeat that I saw a shape dart behind the barn. My breath caught and I nearly lost my grip on the flashlight I was carrying. I told myself it could be my imagination or a trick of the storm, but the whistle that followed, distant yet unmistakable, told me otherwise. Even with the thunder and occasional wind, I recognized that melody. It was the same pattern, at the slightest sound in the late afternoon. Same eerie tune that seemed to tug at my sanity. The storm was intensifying, but I couldn't ignore the compulsion to investigate. My steps toward the barn felt slow and deliberate, like I was wading through water. My heart hammered so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples. My palms were slick with sweat, and I had to wipe them on my pants before gripping the barn door. To my surprise, the door opened easily inside. The darkness was almost total. Broken only by the dim beams of my flashlight, the air smelled wet and met Alice, as though someone had been polishing the old tools in a locked room. I swept the flashlight around, noticing deep shadows in the far corners where the light didn't quite reach. Every now and then, the lightning outside would flash through the small, grimy windows, creating split-second shadows on the barn walls that looked like elongated figures. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't make myself speak. My throat felt paralyzed as I approached a row of large metal hooks. I felt a sudden drop in temperature, an involuntary shiver ran up my spine. Then came a faint rustling sound near a stack of crates. My heart pounded so violently I worried I might pass out. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I needed resolution. I inched closer, knees nearly buckling with each step, when I finally reached the crate's flashlight. Trembling in my grip, I found nothing but dust. Mows drifting in the stale air, a flash of lightning revealed something on the floor, a single footprint in a patch of dust. It was roughly the size of my own, but oddly skewed, like it wasn't made by a standard shoe. I crouched to examine it, noticing how the edges seemed smudged, almost as if the foot had twisted in place. Another whistle echoed from somewhere above me, faint yet maddening. My breath caught in my throat and I snapped my flashlight upward. The rafters overhead looked empty, but something scraped the WI. Stepped back, my calves pressing against a crate. In that moment, I felt more vulnerable than ever before, like every nerve ending in my body was on high alert. I backed out of the barn, never taking my eyes off the rafters, and slammed the door shut. This time I locked it firmly. The storm raged around me as I hurried back to the house, my mind spinning with possibilities I couldn't quite accept. Once inside, I bolted the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat down on the couch, trembling from adrenaline. I couldn't explain what was happening. Was it some intruder messing with me or something less tangible? More insidious night fell quickly in the storm, the sky an unbroken blanket of black. My surroundings felt claustrophobic. Despite the fierce rain pounding against the windows, I could still sense that hush beneath it all, a quiet tension that refused to fade. Every rumble of thunder made me flinch, and each flicker of lightning left me scanning the shadows. I kept expecting to see a face at the window, pressed against the glass in a silent vigil. The hours crept by. I sat in the living room, the single lamp casting a weak circle of light. Occasionally, I thought I heard the whistle between thunderclaps, distant but persistent. My throat felt perpetually dry, and my muscles were so tense they threatened to cramp. I tried to reason with myself to find a rational explanation. Maybe the wind could occasionally mimic a whistle, but the melody was too precise, too deliberate to be a coincidence. Sometimes the tune even seemed to shift slightly, as though reacting to my fear. Whenever I convinced myself it was gone, it would return faint and haunting sometime past midnight. The storm began to calm, yet the lingering electricity in the air felt more potent than ever. The property fell silent once again, an oppressive hush that weighed on my chest. Exhaustion eventually forced me to lie down on the couch. I must have dozed off briefly, because the next thing I knew, I was snapping awake with my pulse skyrocketing. My surroundings were dark, and for a moment I didn't know what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, a long, slow whistle coming from right outside the front door. My eyes darted to the windows, all locked, all covered. The door handle rattled slightly. My blood ran cold. I sat there paralyzed, feeling sweat trickle down my temples. The whistle sounded again, this time accompanied by the faintest tapping noise, like knuckles lightly drumming on wood. Every hair on my body stood on end. My stomach churned and I could barely breathe. I forced myself to stand somehow, mustering the courage to confront the door. My flashlight, flickering with low battery, cast a one glow on the doorknob. Another whistle, impossibly gentle, drifted through the crack between the door and the frame. I don't know how long I stood there, muscles locked, unable to decide whether to open the door or run to my truck. My mind swirled with paranoia, replaying every bizarre event after what felt maybe the man had been wearing unusually dark sunglasses at midnight in the rain. My house never felt so secure as it did that night. Yet sleep evaded me, every creak and settling noise jolted me awake, convinced that something was moving through my home. When I did drift off near dawn, my dreams were filled with dark roads and faceless figures. Morning came with blessed normality. Sunlight streamed through my kitchen window as I made coffee. The night's terror fading into an embarrassing overreaction, I decided to drive past that same spot on my way to work. Convincing myself I'd seen nothing unusual in the harsh light of day, I was right. There was no sign of the man with the shadow eyes, just an empty stretch of road with tall grass and wildflowers swaying in the morning breeze. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by self-deprecating amusement. I'd let my imagination run wild. That's all, perhaps I was more tired than I'd realized. For 3 days, life resumed its predictable patterns, work, home, sleep, repeat. I almost managed to forget about the incident entirely until I started noticing small, unsettling changes. First, it was the electricity lights would flicker without explanation, especially at night. Then appliances began turning themselves on my TV, switching to static at 3 a.m., the blender whirring to life while I showered. I called an electrician who found nothing wrong with my wiring, suggesting it might be power fluctuations from the grid. Then came the shadows. They seemed to move differently in my peripheral vision, lingering a moment too long after I turned on a light. Stretching in directions that defied the positioning of the sun, I'd catch myself staring at the dark corners of rooms, half expecting to see something staring back. My sleep deteriorated further each night. I'd jolt awake with the unshakable certainty that someone was standing at the foot of my bed watching me. By the time I fumbled for the lamp switch, there would be nothing there, but the feeling of being observed persisted. About a week after my encounter, I was driving home late again when my headlights began to dim and flicker the radio, which had been playing quietly amid a high-pitched whine before dissolving into static. A heavy pressure descended on my chest, making each breath a conscious effort as I rounded the bend where I'd first seen him. My car sputtered and died completely. I sat in the sudden silence, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Aware of how exposed I was on this darkened stretch of road, the logical part of my brain ran through possibilities: alternator failure, dead battery, empty gas tank. But another part, the part that remembered those impossible shadow eyes, screamed danger with trembling hands. I tried the ignition again. Nothing, not even the click of a dead battery. It was as if all electrical systems had simply vacated. My phone showed no service, which was unusual even for these rural roads. I was completely cut off. I had two choices: wait in the car until morning or walk the remaining mile and a half home. Neither option appealed to me, but sitting motionless in the dark felt like making myself a target for what I couldn't articulate even to myself. The road stretched before me, bathed in moonlight and mist, beautiful in an ethereal way that did nothing to comfort me. Each step away from my car felt like moving deeper into someone else's territory. The night sounds seemed to recede around me, creating a pocket of silence that followed as I walked. I'd gone perhaps half a mile when I felt it. A subtle change in air pressure, like the atmosphere itself had become attentive. The hair on my arms and neck rose and my mouth went dry. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct warned against it, but humans are cursed with curiosity that overrides self-preservation. I looked back. He stood about 30 yards behind me, exactly as before. Average height, dark coat, ordinary in every way, except for those abyssal shadows where I should be. He wasn't moving, wasn't approaching, just waiting. My legs nearly buckled with the surge of adrenaline. I forced myself to keep walking faster now, my breathing shallow and rapid. I didn't look back again, but I knew. I knew he was following, not with footsteps, not with any sound at all. He would simply be there closer each time. If I turned around the road, ahead shimmered slightly like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. Though the night was cool as I walked, the distortion grew more pronounced. Something was wrong with the air, with reality itself. I rubbed my eyes, but the wavering persisted. That's when I noticed something else. The road wasn't taking me home. I'd been walking for what felt like 20 minutes, and I should have seen my mailbox by now, the large oak tree that marked my property line. Instead, the road stretched endlessly ahead, identical in every direction. Panic bubbled up my throat. I was lost on a road I'd traveled twice daily for years. Impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. I was somewhere else, somewhere that looked like my road but wasn't. Or perhaps I was exactly where I should be, and it was the world that had changed around me. A sound finally broke the unnatural silence. A soft footfall behind me, then another, measured, unhurried, deliberate. I ran my dress shoes slapped against the asphalt, my tie flapping over my shoulder, lungs burning with each gasping breath. The mist thickened around me until I could barely see a few feet ahead. Still I ran, even as a certainty grew within me that I was running in circles, or worse, that I was running directly toward what I was trying to escape. The air temperature plummeted suddenly, my exhaled breath clouded before me, and a bone-deep chill penetrated my suit jacket. The mist parted momentarily, and I saw my house ahead, dark, and still a sanctuary. If I could reach it, I stumbled up the driveway, fumbling with my keys, my hand shaking so violently that it took 3 attempts to fit the key in the lock. As the door swung open, I risked one final glance back. The road was empty. Relief flooded through me as I slammed and locked the door behind me. Home safe, I leaned against the wall, sliding down until I sat on the floor, waiting for my heartbeat to slow to something approaching normal. That's when I noticed how cold my house was. My breath still formed clouds in the air, and it was dark, completely dark, with none of the small indicator lights from appliances or electronics that usually dotted the rooms. A fresh wave of dread washed over me as I reached for the light switch. I already knew it wouldn't work. The house remained pitch black, but in that moment of attempting to turn on the lights, I became aware of something else. A presence in the darkness with me, not moving, not making a sound, just waiting. My phone screen provided the only illumination as I activated its flashlight function with trembling fingers. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across my familiar living room. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing was there. I advanced slowly through the house, checking each room, telling myself I was being paranoid. The flashlight beam trembled with the shaking of my hand, casting juddering shadows that seemed to move independently of its source in my bedroom. The beam fell upon my dresser mirror, and there, reflected behind me, stood the figure not in the room with me. I spun around to confirm this, heart nearly stopping, but somehow in the mirror behind me, those shadow eyes fixed on my reflection, I stumbled backward, dropping my phone. The flashlight beam spun crazily across walls and ceiling before settling, illuminating nothing but ordinary bedroom furniture. When I retrieved it and checked the mirror again, it showed only my terrified face for hours. I sat with my back against the bedroom wall, flashlight trained on the mirror, waiting as dawn approached my phone. Battery died, plunging me back into darkness. I remained motionless, afraid that any movement might attract attention. Morning sunlight eventually filtered through my curtains, revealing a completely normal bedroom. Power was restored, clocks blinking. Needing to be reset outside my car sat in the driveway, though I had no memory of driving at home since that night. I've developed routines. I never drive after dark. I've installed the brightest security lights money can buy around my property. I keep flashlights in every room. Sometimes in unguarded moments, I catch glimpses of him reflected in windows or standing at the periphery of crowded places, always watching with those eyes that aren't eyes always waiting. I've researched local history, looking for stories of missing persons along that stretch of road or accidents involving pedestrians. I found nothing concrete, though there are whispered stories among older residents about travelers who took wrong turns and found themselves on roads that shouldn't exist. What was he, a ghost? A hallucination? Something else entirely? I don't know, but I understand now what he was doing on that road. He wasn't seeking a ride to some physical destination, he was looking for a way in. And I'm increasingly certain that on that night when reality seemed to ripple and shift around me, I inadvertently showed him one. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, now my eyes seem darker than they used to be, just a little, just around the edges. And in those moments, I feel him watching. Not from outside, but from somewhere much closer. Waiting in the first night, I heard the breathing. I convinced myself it was just the old pipe settling by the third night. I knew better something in this house was alive, and it wasn't me. I never wanted to move to Oakage Lane. The neighborhood sat in a depression between two hills where fog settled each evening like a shroud. But the rent was reasonable, and at just 15 minutes from my new job at the tech firm, the location was ideal, a small sacrifice for a career advancement. I told myself just a stepping stone a few years here, then I'd buy something better, something with history that didn't feel wrong, the property. At the threshold of the living room, the TV illuminated the room with a cold blue shimmer. My gaze fell on the glass door, now only partially obscured by the curtains I had drawn earlier. That sense of dread intensified as if an unseen weight pressed against my ribs, drawing a shaky breath. I crept closer to the door, then in the faint reflection cast by the TV light, I noticed the shape again. Only this time it was more distinct, a tall, featureless outline standing just behind me in the reflection. My stomach twisted in terror, and I lurched around, arms raised defensively, but I was alone. The shape was gone from the reflection. My heart hammered so loudly that I could barely hear the sound of my own gasp. Every hair on my body stood on end. The living room was empty, yet the reflection had been so vivid. Waves of cold spread through my limbs, and I felt a surge of lightheadedness. I staggered back, nearly tripping over the edge of the carpet. I thought to myself that maybe the figure was not in the house, but rather inside the reflection itself, like some warped presence of overlapping my own shadow. The idea made no logical sense, but I couldn't shake it. A movement in the corner of my vision made me whip my head around the curtains. Shifted slightly, though there was no breeze to move them. It was as if something had brushed against the fabric from the outside. My breath caught, and I reached out to pull the curtains aside, then stopped. Did I really want to look into the darkness again? My hand shook uncontrollably, but I gritted my teeth and yanked the curtains open. A quick, involuntary hiss escaped my lips when I saw the backyard. It looked entirely empty. The chairs were arranged just as I had left them. The small garden motionless in the windless night, yet the glass itself seemed distorted, rippling like a thin film of water instead of a solid pane. My own reflection appeared, stretched my face, elongated mouth, opening in an expression of silent horror. I felt an urgent need to confirm that I wasn't a man. In inning things, clenching my fist, I rapped my knuckles against the glass. It felt solid, but I saw a subtle shimmer at the point of contact, like a dark ripple that spread outward before vanishing. My breath caught, and I stepped away. The reflection flickered, and once again that tall silhouette seemed to loom just over my shoulder, then blinked out of sight. My instincts screamed for me to get out of there, to retreat back to my bedroom, or possibly leave the house altogether, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. A wave of nausea rolled through me, and I realized I was breathing in quick, shallow pants. The air felt stale and heavy, as though whatever lingered in the reflection had seeped into the room and was now standing right behind me. My arms prickled with goosebumps, and my heart pounded against my chest so hard I feared it would burst, refusing to succumb to the paralyzing grip of fear. I pushed away from the door. My mind leapt from one desperate thought to another. I considered calling someone, maybe a friend, to talk me down from this panic. but it was nearly 4 in the morning and I had no idea what I would even say. I imagined describing the events to another person and realized how absurd it would sound. A strange shadow in my reflection, a door that ripples like water. They would tell me to get some rest or see a doctor. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to slow my breathing. After several frantic heartbeats, I forced myself to think clearly. I repeated a silent mantra. It's not real. You're just seeing things. This is insomnia messing with your head. The more I repeated it, the more. Some small measure of calm returned to me. My breaths came easier and the frantic drum beat in my chest settled into a steady thrum, stealing my nerves. I decided to check every corner of the house to prove to myself there was no intruder. One by one, I turned on lights. The kitchen was just as I'd left it, with a couple of dishes in the sink and no sign of forced entry. The bathroom next to the living room was empty, the shower curtain still drawn back as I had it. By the time I completed my circuit of the downstairs, I had rechecked the door locks, tested the windows, and confirmed everything was secure. The only place I avoided was the glass door. The more stayed away from it, the less I felt the weight of those eyes, that oppressive presence. Eventually, I decided I should try to rest. I turned off the TV, leaving the living room in darkness, and headed upstairs. My legs trembled with every step, exhaustion and anxiety weighing me down like lead. I left the bedroom light on this time, unable to face the thought of lying awake in darkness. I must have drifted in and out of a restless doze around daybreak. I opened my eyes to see the first pale rays of sunlight seeping through the curtains. The morning light dispelled some of the terror, but an uneasy brightness of day. The glass door looked ordinary. No ripples, no distorted reflections. My yard was tranquil, the chairs sat in neat rows, and the few flowers in my small garden were undisturbed. Yet even so, that nagging feeling of having been watched clung to me. I had an almost inescapable sense that some fragment of that shape still hovered in the corner of my vision, as if waiting for dusk to reclaim its power. The memory of that tall silhouette loomed over my thoughts, and the recollection of the glass, rippling beneath my touch, was as vivid as any waking nightmare I had ever experienced. I wished I could dismiss everything as the delirium of a sleepless night. But my racing heart and lingering dread told a different story. Something had invaded my home. Even if it left no footprints or broken locks, it might have remained in the reflection, bridging the boundary between my world and some unsettling dimension. Just beyond ordinary sight in the weeks that followed, I covered the glass door with a thick curtain, one that blocked even the faintest glimmer of light. The moment the sun began to set, I would draw that curtain closed and avoid the living room. If I could sometimes, while upstairs in bed, I would catch myself holding my breath, convinced I had heard a faint scrape against the glass or the whisper of movement beneath the door. On those nights, I hardly slept, running through frantic possibilities in my mind, imagining elongated figures and merging shadows waiting just outside my field of vision. Yet life continued, and I somehow managed to get by with less and less sleep. Friends occasionally commented that I looked exhausted, but I only offered vague excuses about stress and insomnia. I could never bring myself to explain the real reason the events of that single night remained imprinted on my thoughts, lurking like a bruise that refuses to fade. Eventually, I made a decision I wouldn't allow that presence, whatever it was, to dictate my life forever. One evening, I found myself standing in front of that glass door once more, curtain in hand, as the last amber rays of sun dipped below the horizon. My pulse raced, but this time I refused to close the curtain. I opened it wide instead, letting the reflection come into full view. My own eyes stared back at me, and behind that reflection stretched the growing darkness of my yard. For a moment, all I saw was my tired, haunted expression. No shadows flickered, and the glass did not ripple. I'm not sure if that's the end of it, or merely a lull in something much larger. Even now, as I step closer and see my face in the glass, I half expect to catch a glimpse of that shape looming over my shoulder. A chill still caresses my spine when I recall the electric tension in the air, the sense that two realities were overlapping like mismatched puzzle pieces. The memory alone is enough to keep me alert every night, listening for the slightest hint of movement in the backyard. Maybe I did see something that night, or maybe my tired mind conjured a phantom out of loneliness and fear. Either way, the sensation of those unseen eyes on me lingers buried somewhere in my chest like an invisible weight that compresses my ribs when the house is dark and silent. I can't say I'm at peace, but I'm still here, and in the end, perhaps that's all one can hope for in the face of a dread we can't quite name. Remaining watchful, refusing to yield, carrying the memory and the mystery with me into each new day. Yet even as I write these words, I glance at the glass door and brace myself, wondering what I might see the next time I dare to look darkness pressed in on me from all sides, a suffocating weight that made every breath feel shallow. The wind whispered through the pine trees like a warning, rustling their branches in irregular pulses that set my nerves on edge. Even the moon, a weak pale glow, seemed powerless against the immense shadow of the mountains. I had never felt so insignificant under a sky that should have been serene. Instead, it felt like the night was watching me, conscious of my presence, waiting. I had come here with two close friends for what we hoped would be a serene getaway. The promise of crystal clear mountain air and the thrill of being far from civilization had convinced us to plan this trip for months. We set up our 3 tents in a rough semicircle, each just a few feet apart, so that we could share supplies and keep an eye on one another, though it wasn't my first time camping. Something about this particular region made me feel ill at ease from the moment we arrived. The landscape was dramatic, jagged peaks, dense forests, and sparse trails that wound like serpents around the mountainside. The isolation was absolute. Cell phone reception vanished before we even reached the dirt road that led us here. Our first day passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we had stepped into a domain that didn't want us. The sun set behind the mountains early, plunging our campsite into a prolonged twilight. We rough semicircle, each just a few feet apart, so that we could share supplies and keep an eye on one another, though it wasn't my first time camping. Something about this particular region made me feel ill at ease from the moment we arrived. Built a modest fire and shared stories of previous outdoor adventures. While my friends seemed perfectly at ease, I felt a constant prickling at the back of my neck, as if invisible eyes were upon me. Now and again I was certain I heard a light scraping sound like branches against stone, or maybe something more deliberate just beyond the trees. Trying to dispel my unease, I crawled into my tent sometime around midnight, zipping myself into my sleeping bag. The outside world seemed to close in quickly. Soft scuttling noises drifted in on the breeze, and the dense silence of the mountains weighed on my thoughts. I told myself it was just natural forest life. Small animals moving under the cover of night, and that I should be thankful for the experience. I dozed off, eventually lulled by the muffled hush of the wilderness. A few hours later, I snapped awake. My heart was pounding so hard that my ribs felt bruised. Disoriented and covered in cold sweat, I held my breath, trying to understand what had startled me. The darkness inside my tent was thick, but I could detect a low crackling noise. The unmistakable sound of plastic being crumpled. It was faint yet close, as though someone or something was rifling through our supplies. The realization left me with a surge of dread. My breath came in shallow bursts, while a fine tremor spread through my limbs. After fumbling for my flashlight, I unzipped the tent door just enough to peer outside. The night air was piercingly cold, and my lungs seized at the sudden chill. With a shaky hand, I pointed the flashlight beam around the camp. 2 tents flanked mine, forming that near semicircle. The middle one belonged to one of my friends who had already turned in before me. Its entrance flap was closed from the outside, but something about it felt off. A creeping chill prickled the back of my neck as I noticed that the tent appeared oddly flat, almost deflated. Despite being fully zipped up for a moment, I aimed my beam at the supply bags, expecting to find them toppled or rummaged through, but they were untouched. The dryness in my mouth intensified as I realized that nothing looked out of place. I tried to steady myself, telling my heart to slow down, but a dreadful sense of being watched made it impossible to calm down fully. I forced myself out of my tent, fully aware of how vulnerable I was in that moment. Gravel crunched softly under my boots as I took slow steps toward my friend's tent. The air felt charged, as though a storm were about to break. The beam of my flashlight wavered across the brightly colored nylon. I called my friend's name initially in a strained whisper, then louder. When I got no reply, I repeated it again, my voice echoing awkwardly into the silent dark. No response, no stirring from inside, the tension in my stomach. Twisted tighter for a heartbeat, I considered walking over to my other friend's tent first, but an invisible push compelled me to reach the empty one. Immediately after swallowing the lump in my throat, I crouched down to undo the zipper. The quiet rasp of metal teeth gliding open seemed impossibly loud. In the oppressive hush of the night, my flashlight revealed what I dreaded. The inside of the tent was empty, no one inside, no sleeping bag unrolled, no sign of recent occupancy, just some scattered gear and a half-eaten protein bar, as though whoever had been there left in a hurry. Chills swarmed over my skin and my pulse hammered in my ears. My friend had mentioned earlier that he hadn't brought any climbing equipment or fishing gear, so the likelihood that he would wander off at this hour was minimal. Panic wet at me. Where would he go? We had specifically discussed not exploring the surroundings in darkness. I thought I heard a faint shuffle deeper in the woods. It was the kind of noise that stops you in your tracks and sets your hair on end. I felt a strong compulsion to investigate, but an equally potent fear urged me to stay close to camp. Trying to keep my voice level, I called out again, scanning the dense undergrowth with my flashlight. Just as I strained to catch some sign of movement, there came the unmistakable sound of rapid footsteps on damp earth. The steps were quick and deliberate, and they retreated deeper into the forest with alarming speed. My stomach dropped. The footsteps were too heavy to be an animal like a fox or raccoon, but they didn't belong to any of my friends either. Not with that unearthly swiftness hiding the urge to run. I walked toward the sound with my flashlight. Pointed ahead the night beyond, our camp was nearly impenetrable, the trees forming a black wall only a few yards away. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of intrusion. The ground was wet from previous rainfall, so I expected to see at least some indication of movement, but the earth was unmarked. My breath quickened, turning shallow and ragged. A sickening sense that I was being heavier than the last, as if invisible hands tugged at my ankles to keep me from straying further. For a long moment, I stood on the boundary between the campsite circle of light and the forest's blackness. Scanning the darkness, I heard nothing more. My flashlight picked out only gnarled trunks and tangled foliage. The mountain breeze carried the scent of wet pine, giving me the unsettling impression of being inside some creature's dark lungs. Each breath measured and watchful, feeling unsteady, I forced myself back to our circle of tents, my head pounding with uncertainty. My friend was missing. Possibly I thought an intruder was lurking nearby, though I couldn't fathom the motive. If it was a thief, why not take the supplies? Why just slip in and vanish? Without a trace, when I returned to my tent, I half expected to find someone there rummaging through my things. My flashlight beam shook in my hand, and I could barely swallow, my mouth so dry that my tongue felt like sandpaper. I tried to calm myself, telling my trembling hands to relax, to no avail. At length, I decided to wake my other friend stumbling over. I unzipped his tent. He stirred awake immediately, startled by the brightness in his eyes. I described the situation in breathless, fragmented sentences. He listened and told me that he hadn't heard a thing. His expression revealed concern, but also a hint of doubt. Maybe our friend had just gone out to relieve himself or decided to take a short walk. Still, I couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching certainty that something was deeply wrong. We checked around the perimeter once more, finding nothing unusual. Ultimately, we decided there was little else we could do at that hour. I returned to my own tent and tried to rest, though sleep was nearly impossible. My heart that in my chest and every rustle of foliage made my nerves jolt. Eventually, exhaustion went out and I fell into a restless dream. Tortured doze when I next opened my eyes. The harsh light of early morning blinded me. It took a few seconds to remember where I was, and that terrible moment of realization washed over me like ice water. I quickly got up, my muscles aching from the tension of the night. Outside, the campsite looked deceptively peaceful. The sun made the dew on the grass sparkle, and a mild breeze carried the scent of pines and rich earth. But my stomach lurched again when I saw my missing friend standing beside his tent, fiddling with a metal cup as if nothing had happened. My other companion was beside him, pouring water from a thermos. I marched over, ignoring the gnawing ache in my limbs, and demanded an explanation. My friend seemed baffled, insisting he had been in his tent the entire night, and that I must have been mistaken. He swore there was no reason for him to go out in the middle of the night. He was adamant, confused but resolute that I must have had some vivid nightmare. I felt my blood run cold. I had seen his tent empty. I had heard something moving around. I had seen his gear abandoned, and he stood there looking as though he had slept soundly. My other friend, observing our exchange, frowned and tried to reason that stress or exhaustion might have caused me to imagine the whole thing still. I remembered the footsteps in the woods, the plastic crumpling sound, the unzipped and empty interior of that tent. My heart pounded with fresh urgency, and my skin broke out in a cold sweat. There was no way I had hallucinated all of it. We spent the morning checking the surroundings more thoroughly. The dew-laden ground didn't show any footprints. Apart from our own, the supply bags were undisturbed, and the interior of my friend's tent, which I was sure had been empty just hours before, now had his sleeping bag neatly laid out. Every sign pointed to him having been there all night like he claimed. Yet I couldn't shake the prickling sense that some intangible presence was toying with us, warping our perceptions of reality. Throughout the day, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, convinced I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shape that vanished. Whenever I turned my head, my friends grew irritated with my jumpiness and reminded me not to spoil the trip. They told me in more patient tones that I probably needed more rest. But the tension under my skin refused to subside. Even the crisp mountain air felt stifling, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened with menace. As evening approached again, a gray haze settled around the peaks, and the wind picked up, carrying a mournful howl that resonated. Through the valleys, it sounded eerily like someone calling out in distress. My heart knocked against my ribs each time the wind gusted. We ate a quick meal in near silence, my anxiety so high that I barely tasted the food. The entire day had been overshadowed by my lingering doubts and confusion, and as darkness fell, a suffocating sense of dread consumed me. I zipped myself inside my thin nylon shelter, but the barrier felt laughably inadequate against whatever lurked in those woods. Every rustle, every whisper of movement made my skin crawl. My flashlight was clenched in my fist, and I ran through every possible explanation for what I had experienced the previous night. Rational logic offered little comfort, and the creeping paranoia returned full force. At some point, I felt my eyelids grow heavy. My mind drifted between waking and dreaming images of the empty tent and phantom footsteps looping in my head. Then, out of nowhere, a muffled thud pulled me back to full alertness. My pulse hammered so violently that I tasted iron in my mouth. Slowly, I unzipped my tent door just enough to peek outside. The night was starless, overcast sky, swallowing the moonlight. I lifted my flashlight, scanning the campsite. My breath caught in my throat when I saw a tall figure at the edge of the clearing. It stood unnaturally still, as though carved from the darkness itself, before I could even react. The figure turned and drifted away into the trees. Too smooth, too silent, my skin erupted in goosebumps. Everything about it felt wrong, as if I had glimpsed something that shouldn't exist. I wanted to chase after it, confront it, or at least verify it was real, but my legs refused to obey. Every cell in my body screamed to stay put, to hide. Eventually, I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control the trembling that had seized my muscles. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, half crouched in my tent's entrance. Flashlight pointed uselessly into the void. There were no more sounds, no crinkling plastic, no retreating footsteps. Just the punishing silence pressing on my ears until they rang when dawn finally broke. I emerged to find everything exactly as before. Tent flaps closed. Supplies intact, my friend sleeping or pretending to sleep peacefully, yet my world was irreversibly changed. Each subsequent breath felt fragile, as though any small noise might shatter my composure. After my friends woke up, I recounted what I had witnessed this time in an unsteady but urgent manner. They exchanged uneasy looks, uncertain whether to humor my explanation. One of them remarked I was pale and shaking, insisting I should get proper rest, or maybe we should cut the trip short. I agreed to leave that day. We dismantled our campsite under a brooding sky that threatened rain. My missing friend from the previous night remained adamant. He never left his tent, even repeating that he hadn't slept well but was definitely present. I didn't argue further. Something told me the truth was beyond a simple debate. I packed up my gear with trembling hands. The memory of that silent figure seared into my mind as we loaded our belongings into our vehicles. I felt a subtle sense of relief that we were departing those dark mountains. Yet the relief was tainted by a persistent disquiet that place had allowed us to leave, but it had taken something intangible from me. My certainty, my sense of reality. Even now, days later, I can still feel the cold night air against my face, still see the outline of that figure in my peripheral vision whenever I close my eyes. Sometimes late at night, my mind replays the rustling sound of plastic, the empty tent, and the vanished footsteps in the damp earth. I find myself wondering if I'm haunted by some trick of my imagination, or if that remote mountainside harbors forces beyond comprehension. All I know is that my friend insists he was there in his tent, asleep and unknowing. While I recall an empty space where he should have been, the contradiction weighs heavily on me. I haven't been able to fully shake the feeling that something else was walking among us in the darkness, something that could shift perception like a twisted mirror. Perhaps it was just an echo of the land itself, or perhaps it was something far more disquieting, quietly observing us from the depths of that ancient forest. No matter how many nights I spend in the comfort of my own home, now I can't chase away the memory of that oppressive night. Whenever I drift off to sleep, I brace myself for the possibility that I might wake up again to the sound of plastic crumpling in the darkness. My heart pounding in my throat, the adrenaline roaring in my veins, only to step outside and find something vital missing, yet somehow still there. Even if I never set foot on that mountainside again, the fear remains a companion that lurks just beyond the flickering edges of my understanding. It whispers that some experiences can't be explained, only endured, and that what lurked between our tents might follow me wherever I go. The night pressed down on me like a heavy blanket, making every breath feel thick with the promise of something I couldn't name. My tent was a small pocket of light in a vast expanse of darkness pitch at the bottom of a canyon whose towering rock walls trapped every faint echo of wind and distant rustling in my veins, only to step outside and find something. In the daytime, I knew this place as a playground for adventure. Sharp ridges, perfect for rappelling majestic formations that soared against the sky at night. However, those same walls seemed to close in and loom over me like silent, watchful sentinels. The sense of exposure felt overwhelming, as if a single misstep could tip the balance and send the entire cliffside crashing down. Yet I forced myself to settle in, to breathe, to embrace the solitude. It was supposed to be a getaway, a time to reconnect with the raw essence of nature and my own bravery. I was lying on my back, inside the tent, eyes open, letting the darkness swallow my surroundings. My heartbeat was already elevated, a dull thump echoing in my ears. Not from exertion, but from a tension I couldn't quite shake. The canyon floor was colder than I anticipated, and an unexpected dampness seeped through the tent space. Despite the dryness of the desert air, the day's exhaustion tugged at me and my eyelids felt heavy. But just as I began to slip into a fitful sleep, I caught a faint movement on the rock walls outside. A weak glow shimmered across the stone, dancing slowly as though controlled by an unseen hand. For a moment, I tried to dismiss it as starlight, or maybe the reflection of the moon. But no, this was deliberate, a beam of light sliding across the rugged cliff surface. My body tensed and my pulse quickened. I became intensely aware of every sound, or rather the lack of them. No footsteps, no quiet hum of a car engine or campsite chatter. Nothing to suggest another person had arrived at the canyon floor. Still, that glow continued its crawl, moving a couple of meters up the vertical wall. Then, pausing its pace, was painfully slow, deliberate. I sensed my palms getting clammy and my throat felt parched as I tried to swallow. I recalled earlier that evening, before the last threads of sunlight vanished, I had scanned the valley and noticed no other tents, no parked vehicles, no sign of fresh footprints. The fact that I now saw a mysterious beam of light flickering across the canyon face didn't line up with the total isolation I had observed. The contradiction noted at me, fueling a low, vibrating dread in my stomach. There was no one here, I told myself, or at least there wasn't supposed to be. Determined to test if it was a person with a flashlight, I grabbed my own lantern and with a trembling hand unzipped the tent flap. The chill night air slapped me, intensifying the goosebumps that were already forming. I pointed my lantern at the rock wall, aiming roughly at the place I had last seen the glow. I blinked rapidly, my eyes trying to adjust to the sudden brightness of my own beam. Slowly, I moved it in a friendly signaling manner, a clear attempt to communicate with whomever might be out there. My heart drummed in my ears and sweat pulled at my lower back. Despite the coolness of the night, I waited no flicker in response, no shift in their positioning, nothing but the silent hush of the canyon. Then, without warning, the original glow disappeared altogether. My breath caught in my chest. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, scanning the towering wall for any sign of the flickering. The darkness around me felt thicker than before, as though it had swallowed the faint glow and swallowed me too. A part of me wanted to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a camper who didn't see my signal, or someone who switched off their flashlight. But an uneasy voice in my mind insisted that something didn't add up. Usually you hear people clambering around, especially on a rocky surface. Any movement on the canyon wall should produce the crunch of gravel or the slide of loose stones. I heard nothing. The absolute stillness weighed down on me so intensely that my own breathing sounded deafening. I ducked back into my tent, sealing the flap behind me. Inside, my little sanctuary felt less secure now. Every rustle of fabric made me jump, and I kept expecting to see the glow return. Perhaps shining directly into the tent, my chest felt tight, and I noticed how shallow my breaths had become. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick. I sipped from my water bottle, but it did nothing to soothe the rising apprehension. The water felt tepid, sliding down my throat. In an almost nauseating way, I tried to force myself to sleep, telling myself that if I rested, I'd feel more clear-headed in the morning. But every time my mind began to drift, some subtle sound, a rock shifting outside, or maybe just my imagination, jerked me back to full alertness. My back tingled as if unseen eyes were drilling into me from the darkness. When I did doze off for a few minutes, I woke up with my heart pounding. Uncertain whether I'd heard a whisper or dreamed it, it was like being trapped in a half-sleep state, where the boundary between reality and interruptions to my concentration at 8:27 p.m. I remember checking my watch. The temperature in my office dropped dramatically. My breath fogged in the air and my fingers grew stiff with cold. The building's climate control system showed no changes, maintaining its steady 72 degrees. According to the thermostat, I put on my jacket and continued working. Attributing the chill to poor air circulation in the aging structure, the computer screen flickered, displaying momentary distortions that resembled faces, gaunt, elongated visages with hollow eyes that appeared for milliseconds before dissolving back into spreadsheet cells and graphs. I blinked hard, pressed my palms against my eyes, and took several deep breaths. When I looked again, the screen displayed only my work, but the image of those faces remained burned in my mental periphery. The desk phone rang its shrill tone, shattering the silence. My hand hovered over the receiver as dread pulled in my stomach. According to the display, the call originated from extension 842, an office down the hall that I knew to be vacant. After 4 rings, the call transferred to voicemail. The message light remained dark. No recording. I gathered my courage and stepped into the hallway, determined to investigate the empty office. The corridor stretched before me, seemingly longer than during daylight hours. The overhead lights created pools of sickly yellow illumination with deepening shadows between them. I moved slowly, hyper-aware of every sound. The soft pad of my shoes on carpet, the quickening rhythm of my breathing, the thunderous pounding of my heart. Office 842 stood with its door slightly ajar, darkness spilling from the opening like liquid. I pushed the door wider, fumbling for the light switch. The fluorescents buzzed reluctantly to life, revealing a standard office setup desk, ergonomic chair filing cabinet, computer, everything coated with a fine layer of dust except for the phone, which gleamed as if recently polished. I approached it cautiously, noting that its message light was blinking steadily. One new message received, my finger hovered over the playback button. The rational part of my brain argued that a technical glitch had triggered an automated call, that there would be nothing but static or silence on the recording. But deeper instincts screamed warnings. Raising the hair on my arms and the back of my neck before I could decide, the message played automatically, filling the room with the sound of breathing. Not the regular pattern of a living person, but a labored, wet rattling that seemed to emanate from damaged lungs. I backed toward the door, my legs threatening to buckle beneath me. The breathing on the recording accelerated, matching my own panicked gasps. Then came words distorted and stretched but unmistakable. "You belong to the building?" Now the lights extinguished themselves, plunging me into absolute darkness. I turned to flee, but my sense of direction betrayed me. The doorway had vanished, or perhaps I had become disoriented in my panic. My outstretched hands encountered only wall where the exit should have been. I moved laterally, fingers scrabbling against the surface, searching desperately for the frame of the door. The breathing from the recording continued, now seeming to come from directly behind me rather than the phone. A cold pressure settled between my shoulder blades like a hand made of ice pressing through my jacket and shirt to touch my skin. My muscles locked in terror as it trailed upward to the nape of my neck. The building's fire alarm activated without warning. The strobe effect of emergency lights revealing the room in fractured freeze frames. The exit appeared before me, and I lunged through it, stumbling into the hallway where other alarms blared in synchronized chaos. Employees from the few occupied offices emerged, looking confused and irritated by the disruption. None showed signs of having experienced anything unusual beyond the inconvenience of an evacuation outside, standing amid a scattered group of annoyed co-workers in the building's plaza. I gazed up at the 8th floor. In the window of office 8-42, a silhouette stood watching a figure composed more of absence than substance, a void in human shape that seemed to absorb the emergency lights rather than reflect them. I called in sick the following day and the day after. When I finally returned, I requested an office reassignment, citing poor ventilation affecting my asthma. My manager seemed understanding, even mentioning that my predecessor had made similar complaints. The company relocated me to the 6th floor in a corner office with windows on 2 sides and better lighting. The space feels safer, more exposed to natural light and the activities of colleagues. But sometimes in the reflection of my monitor, when the screen dims, I see that office on the 8th floor. And sometimes when I work past sunset, I hear the elevator stop on 8. Although I've pressed 6, the door's opening to reveal an empty corridor illuminated by pulsating. Witnessing something beyond my understanding. Sweat dripped down my temples, and I had to force myself to keep breathing so I wouldn't hyperventilate. Every instinct screamed at me to zip the tent shut, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the glow. It pulsed softly, shifting from one side of the boulder to the other. My mind struggled to label it an optical illusion, a trick of the moon, a reflection from some hidden metallic object. But the more I watched, the clearer it became that this glow was moving with intent. It paused occasionally as if studying me, then resumed its slow dance. My body was overtaken by chills, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt a tightness in my chest, the primal terror that comes from an encounter with something you can't explain and can barely comprehend. My thoughts spiraled. Was it a person with some advanced gear? Was it something that defied natural explanation? I recalled an older climber once describing a phenomenon in remote areas. Lights that seemed to have a will of their own. He had said in a hushed, serious tone that if you ever encountered them, you should look away, because when you stare too long, they might just stare back. At the time, I had dismissed it as superstition, yet now that warning felt all too real. resonating through my mind like a frantic alarm. A sudden gust of wind swept through the canyon, rattling the tent and stirring up a small swirl of dust outside. The light flickered erratically, then disappeared behind the boulder. My vision blurred for a second, and I wasn't sure if I had truly seen it vanish, or if it had merely moved out of my line of sight. Darkness settled once more, an oppressive claustrophobic blackness that felt alive. I slumped back, chest heaving hard, battering my ribs for the rest of that night. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, my lantern flickering weakly eyes darting around the tent as though the walls themselves might close in when dawn finally arrived. I was still shaking every muscle in my body, screaming with tension and fatigue. I crawled out of the tent and inspected the spot where I had last seen the glow. The boulder looked ordinary, just a slab of rock with a slightly weathered surface. There was no sign of footprints, no scuff marks from shoes or equipment. Running my hand over the stone, I felt a persistent trembling in my fingers as though some residual energy clung to the surface. My rational mind told me it was just my nerves, but a deeper part of me suspected otherwise. I forced myself to eat a quick breakfast and hastily packed up my gear. My eyes continuously scanning the ridges above the silence weighed on me, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I questioned my own sanity. Could I have imagined it all conjured by the isolation and the echoing hush of the canyon? But the memory of that dancing glow felt too tangible. Its slow, deliberate movements etched into my mind like a scar. Despite wanting to cling to logic, I couldn't bear to stay another night. I strapped my pack on, feeling the sweat of anxiety sliding down my spine. My throat still burned from dryness. The climb out of the canyon tested my endurance, especially given how little rest I'd had, but each heave of my legs took me closer to open ground and away from whatever had haunted me in that valley. Once I reached my vehicle, I paused, looking back one last time at the colossal rock walls. The sunlight had turned them gold, making them appear grand and almost inviting. Yet I couldn't shake the conviction that something hid within those shadows. Something that watched and waited as I drove away. The sense of relief was immediate, but my pulse stayed elevated, and a cold sweat clung to my skin. For miles, even now, days later, my mind cycles through the same questions. Did I truly witness a phenomenon that defies easy explanation, or did my own fears manifest into something that felt real each night? Since my sleep has been fractured occasionally in that liminal space between wakefulness and slumber, I see a faint light dancing at the periphery of my vision. I bolt upright, heart racing, only to find myself alone in my dimly lit bedroom. That persistent dread won't let me go, as if some part of the canyon followed me back. Whenever I close my eyes, I recall the silent glow creeping along the rock face. Independent of any mortal hand, the realization that I can't definitively explain it has left me with a nagging sense of vulnerability and an unsettling certainty that some mysteries are best left undiscovered. Even now, as I recount these details, my pulse quickens and my palms grow slick with sweat, no matter how I try to rationalize it. The memory remains. Vivid, a drifting radiance in the dark, responding to nothing I did, answering no questions and offering no clues to its origin. It remains out there on those canyon walls, waiting for anyone who dares to camp in that lonely stretch of land. The experience has woven itself into my nightmares, a trembling reminder that true incoming call in my call history. Instead, there was a notification I hadn't seen before. One new voicemail received at 3:17 a.m. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. I stared at the notification, trying to reconcile what I knew had happened with what my phone was telling me. I had answered that call. I had heard the static. There should be a record of it, but instead there was only this voicemail from a call I had no memory of receiving or missing. With a sense of growing unease, I pressed play on the voicemail and held the phone to my ear for several seconds. There was nothing but that same static I'd heard when answering the phone. Then, emerging from the white noise like a figure appearing through heavy fog, came a voice. It was distorted, pitched too low to be natural, with a metallic quality that made it sound almost mechanical. But despite the distortion, I could clearly hear it speak my name, Not my nickname or shortened form, but my full formal name that few people used. The voice repeated it 3 times each, utterance more drawn out than the last, elongating the vowels until my name was barely recognizable. Then the voice began to speak again in what sounded like sentences, but the words were unintelligible, either in a language I didn't recognize or so heavily distorted that English became unrecognizable. Beneath the voice was a rhythmic metallic scraping, like a blade being drawn slowly across a metal surface. The message continued for 47 seconds before cutting off abruptly mid-syllable as if the speaker had been interrupted. My hands were trembling by the time the message ended. I played it again, straining to make sense of the garbled speech, but could discern nothing beyond my name. I checked the number. It matched the one I'd seen on my screen at 3:17 a.m., but when I tried to call it back, an automated voice informed me that the number was not in service. A quick internet search revealed nothing. The number wasn't associated with any business or listed in any directory I could find. I tried to approach the situation rationally. It was probably just an elaborate ruse call, a new type of scam. The distortion could be a technical glitch, and perhaps they had my name from some data breach. The absence of the call in my history might be due to my half-awake state. Maybe I had dreamed answering the phone and had actually slept through the call, which went to voicemail. These explanations felt flimsy even as I formulated them, but they were preferable to the alternative that something inexplicable had occurred. Sunday passed in a haze of unease. I found myself checking my phone compulsively, both dreading and anticipating another call. None came. I spent hours researching obscure phone scams and voice distortion techniques, trying to find something that matched my experience. My searches yielded nothing conclusive. That night I broke my routine and kept my phone on my bedside table, both as a challenge to whatever had happened and out of a strange fear of having it out of reach. I slept poorly, waking at the slightest sound, but no call came. Monday brought the distraction of work client meetings and colleagues who knew nothing of my disturbed weekend. I began to distance myself from the experience, compartmentalizing it as an unsolved but ultimately insignificant mystery. By Wednesday, I had almost convinced myself it had been nothing more than a bizarre technical glitch, combined with my own sleep-deprived imagination. Almost it was Thursday night when things escalated. I was working late at home, sprawled on my couch with blueprints scattered around me and my phone resting on the coffee table at precisely 10:46 p.m. My phone screen lit up with an incoming text message. The number was different from the one that had called, but similarly unfamiliar. The message contained a single word listening. A chill ran through me. I stared at the message, trying to determine if it could be spam or a message sent to the wrong number as I was debating whether to respond. A second text arrived from the same number, 317. My mouth went dry. My heart began to pound so hard I could feel it in my fingertips as they hovered over the screen. This couldn't be a coincidence before I could decide what to do. A third message appeared soon. I immediately tried to call the number back. It rang once before connecting to nothing. No voicemail, no automated message, just that same staticky silence. I had heard on Sunday morning. I hung up and blocked the number, then sat in my suddenly too quiet apartment. Listening to the sound of my own rapid breathing sleep was impossible that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound from the street below or the neighboring apartments around 2:30 a.m. I noticed my phone's battery was getting low despite having been charged all evening as I watched the battery percentage drop rapidly from 42% to 36% to 29%, as if something was actively draining it. I plugged it in, but the battery continued to deplete despite being suggesting heavy outdoor gear. These prints looped around my tent in a crazy pattern. No clear direction or purpose, just circles and figure eights. It was as if someone had been pacing aimlessly or maybe trying to intimidate me. Every hair on my neck stood on end when I recognized IED that these footprints came dangerously close to where I had been sleeping. My breath caught in my throat and I felt a surge of cold sweat across my forehead, kneeling down to inspect the prints. I noticed the depth. Whoever wore those boots was either very large or carrying something heavy. The ground was still moist from the previous day's drizzle, so the footprints were crisp and fresh. They had not been made earlier in the day, they were definitely from the night before. I thought about packing up immediately, but a stubborn part of me wanted to know who or what had been skulking around. Determined, I followed the footprints a short distance into the surrounding brush. They LED about 30 or 40 yards away, weaving between trees and shrubs until the vegetation grew denser. Then they simply vanished, as though the person wearing those boots had lifted off the ground. No broken branches, no second set of prints heading in another direction. I felt an icy knot in my stomach at the abrupt end of the trail. If a hunter had decided to check out my campsite, why abandon the pursuit in such a random spot? A creeping sense of unreality began to set in, as if this was some bizarre dream. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a local who didn't appreciate strangers on the land. Or perhaps I was just so exhausted that I overlooked more footprints and got lost. Yet something inside me whispered that the explanation wasn't that simple. Despite my rising paranoia, I decided to stay another night. Part of me felt stubborn. I hadn't caught much fish, and I didn't want to let fear dictate my actions. Another part of me, though, was morbidly curious. I told myself I'd be prepared. If the footsteps returned, I had a strong flashlight and a camping knife, and I could drive away at any moment if necessary. The rest of the day was tense. I couldn't relax. Even as I cast my line into the river, the sunlight reflecting off the water seemed too bright, almost painful to the eyes. My every breath felt labored, my chest tight with underlying panic. I thought I saw shapes moving in the trees beyond my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned my head, there was nothing but trunks and foliage. Once I heard what sounded like a whistle, low and almost melodic. It echoed through the grove of trees. I froze, glancing around to see if someone was nearby, but the whistle never repeated, and no one emerged by late afternoon. The clouds gathered overhead, stealing away what little warmth the day had offered. The wind picked up, rustling the canopy of leaves in an eerie, whispering chorus. My eyes darted around the landscape, seeking any hint of movement. I felt that unshakable sensation of being observed, as if unseen eyes tracked my every move. The fleeting comfort I had found in the stillness of the day was gone, replaced by a kind of grinding anxiety as the light waned. I rebuilt the campfire with trembling hands. The snap of the kindling seemed deafening in the hush around me. My stomach churned, and each breath came too quickly when darkness finally descended. It felt heavier than the night before, as though the gloom itself had thickened. Every flicker of flame cast dancing shadows on the rock and trees, warping them into grotesque shapes. I tried to calm myself by imagining rational explanations. Perhaps I was spooking myself with ghost stories in my own head. Perhaps those footprints belonged to a camper who'd spotted my tent and thought to have some fun at my expense, but the tension in my body refused to subside. My hands were slick with sweat, and I caught myself flinching at the smallest crackle of the fire. At some point, I drifted into a fitful doze hunched near the dying flames. Dreams plagued me, images of tall figures shrouded in darkness, peering at me from behind the boulders in one fleeting vision. I saw something humanoid but distorted, with elongated limbs and a face that hovered between man and shadow. Even when I snapped awake, I couldn't fully shake the impression that those shapes lingered just out of sight. It was close to midnight when I heard it again, the crunch of leaves and twigs. A deliberate footstep, my chest constricted, and I held my breath, pressing my back against one of the large rocks for cover. My flashlight was in my left hand, my camping knife in my right. My heart pounded so violently I feared whoever was out there would hear it. The steps moved closer, almost teasing in their slowness. I felt my throat go dry, and my mind screamed at me to confront it, to shine the beam of light in that direction, but I was too terrified. Then the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound itself. I forced myself to flick on the flashlight, sweeping it across the camp for an instant. Patio surrounded by neglected shrubs, the property manager had called it garden access. Now I understand why the previous tenant left so abruptly, breaking their lease without even collecting their security deposit. I first noticed it 3 weeks ago, a routine midnight trip to the kitchen for water before bed. The overhead light was off. I know my way around well enough and didn't want the harsh fluorescence to fully wake me. The kitchen was lit only by the dim glow of the digital clock on the microwave and whatever ambient light filtered in from the street lamps outside. I filled my glass at the sink, and as I turned to head back to bed, I caught a glimpse of movement in the glass door, a dark shape where there shouldn't have been one. Hovering just behind my left shoulder, my body responded before my mind could process what I was seeing. Heart lurching into my throat, I spun around, sloshing water onto the linoleum. Nothing. The hallway stretched empty and dark behind me. I stood motionless. Water dripping from my fingers, ears straining for any sound. Besides my own shallow breathing after a full minute of silence, I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, or perhaps my own drowsy brain. Manufacturing images in the darkness, but when I turned back toward the glass door, it was there again, not directly behind me anymore, but standing slightly to the side as if it had moved. While I was looking away this time, I could make out more details. The vague outline of a head, the curve of hunched shoulders arms that hung too long and too still at its sides. It didn't appear solid, more like a smudge of deeper darkness against the shadows reflected in the glass. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, squinted at the reflection. The shape remained unmoving now when I raised my hand. It didn't mirror my movement when I took a step forward. It stayed in place only when I finally gathered the courage to whirl around again did it disappear, and only from my direct view I knew somehow that if I turned back to the glass it would still be there. Watching, I left the water glass on the counter and retreated to my bedroom that night, double-checking the lock on my door before huddling under the covers like a child. Sleep came eventually, but it was thin and troubled, filled with dreams of standing in front of mirrors that reflected someone else's movements. The following morning, under the harsh light of day, I almost managed to convince myself I'd imagined it all. Sleep deprivation from too many late nights at the office, stress from the upcoming performance review, perhaps even the beginning of a migraine. There were plenty of rational explanations. I went about my day deliberately pushing the incident from my mind that evening. I installed brighter bulbs in the kitchen light fixtures and made a point of keeping them on whenever I entered the room. After sunset for 3 days, this strategy worked. The increased illumination eliminated most of the reflective quality of the glass door, and I could fetch my evening water without incident. I began to relax, to believe the whole thing had been nothing more than an isolated episode, a quirk of an exhausted mind. Then the power went out. A brief summer storm had knocked out electricity to several blocks in my neighborhood. Nothing serious. The property manager assured all tenants via text that it would likely be restored by morning. I found my flashlight, set out some candles, and settled in for an early night around midnight. Thirst drove me from my bed to the kitchen. The beam of my flashlight cast elongated shadows that danced across the walls. As I moved, the kitchen was eerily silent, without the usual hum of the refrigerator. I filled my glass by flashlight, then set the light on the counter, pointing upward to create ambient illumination while I drank. That's when I felt it, a distinct drop in temperature, as if someone had opened a freezer door behind me. The hairs on my arms stood on end and my breath fogged slightly in front of my face. Slowly, reluctantly, my gaze moved to the glass door. It was there, clearer than before. The diffused glow of the flashlight created the perfect conditions for the door to become a mirror, and what it reflected chilled me more thoroughly than the sudden cold snap. The figure stood directly behind me now, close enough that I should have felt its breath on my neck. Its form was still indistinct, like a person shaped from smoke or ink and water, but I could now make out what might have been facial features, hollow depressions where eyes should be a gash-like opening in place of a mouth. As I watched frozen in place, its head tilted slightly as if in curiosity. One elongated arm began to rise. Reaching toward my shoulder, I could see the movement clearly in the reflection. Could track the approach of those impossibly long fingers, but felt nothing on my skin. My lungs burned before I realized I'd been holding my breath when I finally gasped for air. The sound was explosively loud in the silent apartment. I spun around. Flashlight already raised as a makeshift weapon. Nothing, empty air greeted me. The temperature had already normalized, my breath no longer visible. I swept the flashlight beam across every corner of the kitchen and adjacent hallway, finding nothing out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the certainty that something had almost touched me or tried to. I avoided the kitchen for the rest of that night, ignoring my parched throat until morning brought both sunlight and restored electricity at work. I researched the history of my apartment building, looking for any tragedies or unusual events that might explain what I was experiencing. The structure was relatively new, only 15 years old, built on what had previously been an empty lot. No reported deaths, no notorious incidents, nothing that would account for a haunting. If that's what this was, I considered the possibility that I was experiencing some sort of neurological event. Hallucinations could be symptoms of serious conditions, but the phenomenon seemed too specific, too localized to that one reflective surface. I could look in my bathroom mirror without incident. The stainless steel of my refrigerator door reflected. Normally, it was only the glass patio door that showed me things that shouldn't be there that night. I conducted an experiment. I set up my phone to record video of the kitchen. While I stood in front of the glass door, the resulting footage showed only me alone staring tensely at my reflection. But I had seen it again just as clearly as before, the dark figure standing behind me this time, with what looked like one hand raised to its distorted mouth as if signaling for silence. After a week of increasing encounters, I developed a system. Kitchen lights always on at night, quick in and out. No lingering, never looked directly at the glass door. If it could be avoided, I rearranged my furniture so I could approach the sink from an angle that minimized exposure to the reflection. When I absolutely had to face that direction, I kept my eyes unfocused, looking through rather than at the glass. But avoidance strategies can only work for so long. The figure grew bolder, appearing earlier in the evening, remaining visible even with the lights on. Though more transparent, sometimes I'd catch glimpses of it from the corner of my eye while cooking dinner. Other times I'd feel that distinctive temperature drop while sitting on my couch, only to look up and see it watching me from the reflection in the TV screen when it was turned off last night. Things escalated. I woke suddenly at 2 a.m., my mouth dessert dry heart pounding from a nightmare. I couldn't remember the need for water was overwhelming. I stumbled to the kitchen, flicked on the light, and froze. The glass door was covered in condensation from the inside as if someone had been breathing on it. In the foggy surface, a finger had traced 3 words, "Not your reflection." My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Temperature differences between inside and outside condensation patterns forming coincidental shapes, my own subconscious interpreting random marks as words. But I knew what I had seen before. I could think better of it. I approached the door and wiped my hand across the glass, erasing the message. The surface was bone dry. I backed away, bumping into the kitchen counter. Hard enough to send a mug crashing to the floor. The sound shattered the midnight silence, and in that moment of distraction, I glanced at the glass door again. The figure was there, more substantial than ever before, no longer just a silhouette. It now had definition. The suggestion of clothing, a face still shrouded in shadow but unmistakably turned toward me. Worst of all, it was no longer mimicking my position. While I stood pressed against the counter, it was moving toward the glass from the other side, one hand raised, fingertips pressing against the barrier between us. I watched, paralyzed, as frost began to form around those points of contact, delicate crystalline patterns spreading outward across the glass. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted so rapidly that I heard the distinct ping of glassware contracting in the cabinets. My exhaled breath billowed in front of me like smoke. Something in me finally broke. I lunged for the light switch, plunging the kitchen into darkness, then stumbled blindly back to my bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind me. I huddled under my blankets until dawn, listening to the soft rhythmic tapping that seemed to travel from the kitchen down the hall to stop just outside my bedroom door. This morning I called in sick to work and contacted a real estate agent. I told her I needed to sublet my apartment immediately, making up a story about a job opportunity in another state. She asked about the lease termination fees. I told her they didn't matter. Tonight is my last night here. The new tenant moves in tomorrow afternoon. I didn't tell her about the glass door or what I've seen in it. Perhaps it's something specific to me, some projection of my own. psyche that won't affect her at all, or perhaps she'll never notice. We'll keep the blinds drawn and the lights bright and never have reason to see what waits in the reflection. It's nearly midnight. Now I've packed everything except a mattress and the clothes I'll wear tomorrow. My throat is dry from moving boxes all day, but I've been holding a bottle of water close, taking small sips to avoid any need to return to the kitchen. I should sleep in less than 12 hours. This will all be behind me, but there's a part of me that needs to know a part that won't let me leave without understanding what has been watching me all these weeks. So here I stand one last time in front of the glass door. The kitchen lights are off. The only illumination comes from my phone's flashlight propped on the counter to cast just enough glow to create reflections. The figure is already there, has been waiting for me. It seems more solid tonight, less a shadow and more a presence. We face each other, me and the kitchen. In whatever space exists inside or beyond the glass, I raise my hand, it mirrors me. Raising its own, I step closer. It does the same for the first time I speak to it directly, asking what it wants from me. The reflection's mouth moves, but I hear nothing. Instead, frost begins to form on the glass again, patterns swirling into letters, then words to switch places as understanding dawn. I notice something I've been too frightened to see before. The figure isn't some supernatural entity or ghost. The face taking shape in the glass, it's my own but wrong. Somehow eyes too hollow, smile too wide, posture too hunched. I've been looking at myself all along, but not my reflection, my replacement. I back away from the door, shaking my head. The figure, my distorted double, presses both hands against the glass, now leaving spreading frost in the shape of palms and fingers. The barrier between us seems thinner than ever, vibrating slightly like a membrane about to rupture. I should run. I know I should run instead. I find myself wondering, how long has it been watching? Has it always been there, waiting for me to notice? And what happens if one night I turn around quickly enough to catch it outside the reflection I won't find out tonight? I grab my keys and phone, leaving everything else behind. The motel 6 miles away isn't comfortable, but it has no large glass surfaces, and that's all that matters now tomorrow. I'll be gone from this place for good. I'll move to another city, another state somewhere. I can start fresh. I'll avoid ground floor apartments. I'll cover mirrors at night. I'll be careful about reflective surfaces, and I'll never again look too long at my own reflection for fear of noticing that its movements come just a fraction of a second before my own. The 7th floor of my building doesn't exist. At least that's what I told myself until 3 weeks ago the elevator panel shows it. Clearly buttons for floors 1 through 12, but everyone knows the building was designed with the superstition of certain cultures in mind. No 13th floor, no 7th floor, just an architectural quirk, a numbering system that jumps from 6 to 8. I never questioned it until that Friday evening when everything I thought I knew about my home began to unravel. The chill that ran down my spine. When the elevator stopped at the 7th floor still haunts me. It wasn't supposed to be there. I've always been a creature of habit after 5 years working at the same accounting firm. I've perfected my routine, leave the office by 5:30 p.m., catch the 5:40 bus and arrive at my apartment building by 6 p.m. Sharp. The predictability comforts me. 12 floors of identical corridors, identical doors, identical lives stacked one atop another. My little box on the 9th floor has been home for 6 years. Now that particular Friday had been brutal end of quarter reports, a system crash that nearly lost 3 weeks of data, and my boss breathing down my neck about deadlines. By the time I dragged myself into the lobby of my building, my shoulders ached with tension, and a dull throb had established itself behind my right eye. Mrs. Garza from the 5th floor nodded to me from her mailbox. We exchanged our usual pleasantries about the unseasonably cool weather, the familiar scent of Mr. Patterson's cooking. Something with garlic and onions drifted down from his 1st floor apartment. Everything normal, everything as it should be. The elevator arrived with its customary ding, and I stepped inside, grateful to find it empty. I jabbed the button for the 9th floor and leaned against the back wall. Loosening my tie, the door slid closed and the familiar hum of machinery filled the small space as the elevator began its ascent. 1, 2, 3. The illuminated numbers changed on the panel. My eyelids grew heavy, 4, 5, 6. The elevator slowed unexpectedly. The sudden deceleration made my stomach lurch. I opened my eyes just as the display changed to 7, 7. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. There was no 7th floor. Everyone knew that. Management had even sent out a memo when I first moved in, explaining the numbering system, cultural considerations resulting in the omission of certain floors. Yet here I was stopping at a floor that shouldn't exist. The doors slid open with painful slowness. Beyond them lay a corridor identical to mine, yet fundamentally wrong. The hallway stretched into darkness, the overhead lights either burnt out or never installed. Only the faint red glow of an exit sign at the far end provided any illumination. Casting the corridor in a bloody hue, the air that rushed in felt wrong, stale, and unnaturally cold. Carrying a faint scent, I couldn't identify something ancient and musty like old books left too long in a damp basement. My heart hammered against my ribs. I jabbed the close door button repeatedly. My finger becoming more frantic with each press, nothing happened. The doors remained stubbornly open as if inviting me to step out into that impossible hallway. That's when I heard them footsteps slow and deliberate coming from somewhere down the darkened corridor. The sound echoed oddly as if the space were much larger than it appeared. I pressed myself against the back wall of the elevator, my mouth dry as sand. The footsteps grew closer, yet I could see nothing moving in the shadows. My rational mind grasped for explanations. A maintenance worker, another resident, a security guard making rounds. But why would anyone be on a floor that didn't exist? A blast of frigid air swept into the elevator, bringing with it that musty smell. Now stronger, my teeth began to chatter, partly from cold, partly from fear. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the elevator doors. I couldn't see anyone there, just the empty threshold between elevator and corridor. Yet I felt a presence, a weight in the air, a pressure against my skin. Something was standing there watching me. My breath came in short, painful gasps. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears. My vision began to narrow, darkness creeping in at the edges. I was going to pass out. Part of me welcomed it with a final, desperate lunge. I slammed my palm against the control panel, striking every button. At once, the elevator chimed in protest, but the doors finally mercifully began to close as the gap narrowed. I felt something brush past me, a cold current of air, or perhaps something more substantial. The hairs on my arms and neck stood on end for a fraction of a second. I thought I caught a whiff of cologne, old-fashioned and heavy with spice, mingling with that musty odor. Then the doors sealed shut and the elevator lurched upward. I collapsed against the wall, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. Sweat soaked through my shirt. Despite the lingering chill, the overhead light flickered once, twice, then stabilized as the elevator continued its journey when the display showed 9. I bolted out the moment the doors opened wide enough to squeeze through. Standing in the familiar well-lit corridor of my floor, I gulped down air that tasted normal, smelled normal as I fumbled with my keys at my apartment door. I glanced back just in time to see the elevator doors closing. The digital display above the elevator showed it was descending to the 7th floor. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake dissecting what had happened, searching for rational explanations. Perhaps the building's numbering system was just for show, a marketing gimmick to appeal to superstitious buyers. While the actual floor still existed, maybe I had misread the display, hallucinating a 7 where there was actually a 6 or an 8. I decided to ask my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, about it. The next morning, she'd lived in the building since it was constructed. When I casually mentioned the 7th floor, her expression changed. Subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a slight pursing of the lips. She asked why I wanted to know. Her tone remained pleasant, but something in her voice made me backpedal. I laughed it off, saying I was just curious about the building's design. She nodded and mumbled something about architectural superstitions before hurriedly excusing herself. Her reaction only deepened my unease that weekend. I took the stairs everywhere, 12 flights up and down, left my legs burning. But the alternative, facing that elevator again, was unthinkable by Monday morning. However, I couldn't avoid it any longer, late for work. After a nearly sleepless night, I stood before the elevator, my palm hovering over the call button just as I was about to press it. Mr. Abernathy from the 12th floor joined me in the lobby. His presence bolstered my courage, safety in numbers. I told myself the elevator arrived. We both got in, and I pressed 9 while he selected 12. The ride was uneventful for the next week. I timed my comingings and goings to coincide with other residents. Never alone in the elevator, never vulnerable. The incident began to lose its sharp edges in my memory, softening into something that could have been a stress-induced hallucination. Long hours, exhaustion, and overactive imagination that had to be it until last Tuesday I worked late. Much later than usual by the time I dragged myself home. The lobby was deserted. I stood before the elevator debating whether to tackle the stairs. Despite my exhaustion, the display showed the elevator was already on its way down from an upper floor. I decided to wait, hoping another resident might join me. No one came when the doors opened to an empty car. I hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. I needed sleep more than I needed to indulge this paranoia. The ride began normally enough, 1, 2, 3. My muscles gradually relaxed as the elevator passed each floor without incident, 4, 5, 6. My phone chimed with a text message as I reached into my pocket. The elevator lurched violently, throwing me against the wall. The lights flickered and for one terrifying moment went out completely before resuming at half their normal brightness. The display read 7. My heart nearly stopped. Not again. I lunged for the control panel, but before I could reach it, the elevator came to a smooth halt. The door slid open. The 7th floor corridor appeared different. This time illuminated for one thing, though the light was sickly and uneven, emanating from sconces along the walls. Rather than overhead fixtures, the wallpaper pattern matched the rest of the building. But the colors were wrong, faded, as if exposed to years of sunlight. The carpet beneath the doors showed visible wear patterns, and the doors themselves. They had numbers 7017022703, apartment numbers for a floor that didn't exist. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable even to reach for the close button. My gaze traveled down the hallway, taking in details I'd missed in the darkness. Before the exit sign at the end still glowed red, but now I could see that one of the apartment doors stood slightly ajar. 707, just a crack, but enough to reveal absolute darkness beyond a cold draft seeped from that opening, carrying with it that same musty smell, now identifiable as old paper dust and something metallic like copper pennies or blood. The elevator chimed impatiently somehow. That mundane sound broke my paralysis. I stabbed at the close button. Then at 9, then at every button I could reach, the doors remained open. The chime sounded again, louder this time, almost admonishing from the partially open door of 707. I heard movement, a soft shuffling like slippered feet dragging across carpet. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice, humming a melody I almost recognized, distorted by the poor acoustics of the hallway. An old tune, the kind my grandfather might have whistled the door to. 707 began to swing wider. I threw myself at the elevator doors, trying to force them closed with my bare hands. My fingers scrabbled uselessly against the metal. The humming grew louder, closer. Light from the hallway illuminated a pale hand curling around the edge of the door to 707. At that moment, the elevator doors finally responded. Sliding shut with agonizing slowness, I caught a glimpse of something emerging from 707, a shape of figure moving with unnatural, jerky motions toward the elevator. The doors sealed just as a shadow fell across the threshold. The elevator resumed its journey as if nothing had happened. No lurching, no flickering lights, just the smooth hum of machinery carrying me upward. I collapsed against the wall, my clothes soaked with cold sweat, my breathing rapid and shallow. When I reached my floor, I ran to my apartment and locked every lock, even using the security chain I'd never bothered with. Before I spent the night with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and settling noise of the building. That was a week ago. I've taken the stairs exclusively since then. No matter how tired I am yesterday, I inquired with management about the building's floor plan, keeping my tone casual, curious. The property manager, a new hire who didn't know me, was happy to show me the original architectural drawings there on paper. Plain as day 12 floors with 7 conspicuously absent. The space between floors 6 and 8 was reduced as if floor 7 had been erased, not just in name, but in physical reality. Why no 7th floor? I asked, forcing lightness into my voice. The manager explained it was common in many buildings, cultural superstitions, marketing considerations, nothing unusual. When I pressed further, asking if there had ever been plans for a 7th floor, her demeanor changed. She suddenly remembered an urgent call she needed to make and ushered me out of her office last night. I did something I'd been avoiding. I accessed the building's online tenant portal and checked the directory. No apartments numbered in the 700s, no residents assigned to a 7th floor. According to every official record, it doesn't exist yet. I know what I saw, what I felt, what I heard this morning. Mrs. Chen from across the hall stopped me as I was leaving for work. She looked tired with dark circles under her eyes. "You asked about the 7th floor," she said without preamble. I nodded. My mouth suddenly dry. She glanced over. Flashlight or the uncertain glow from the storm-lashed moon? But the pounding of my heart refused to believe those reassurances, and I found myself whispering reassurances to no one in particular, reminding myself to hold on until morning when dawn arrived. Its pale light brought little comfort. I forced myself outside, determined to check the roof in full daylight. My stomach churned with nausea, and I felt unsteady on my feet, as if I had been awake for days, climbing up on an old wooden stool. I carefully ran my hand along the edge of the roof, expecting to feel cracked tiles or find some tangible sign of disturbance. Nothing, no loose panels, no footprints, no broken branches above. It was as if the footsteps had never happened yet. I knew what I heard, and the memory of that slow, deliberate pacing made my skin crawl. I decided then that my stay in the cabin needed to end. My nerves were shot, and my sense of reality was wavering. I gathered my notes, stuffed them into my duffel bag, and tidied up the cabin, anxious to depart before nightfall returned. While packing, I occasionally thought I heard faint echoes in the hallway, but they vanished the moment I stepped in to investigate. At one point, I was sure I felt the floor quiver under my feet as if someone was stepping just behind me, but the cabin was empty. My heart hammered, and I felt a surge of dizziness, like the walls were closing in sweat, clung to my forehead, and I had to close my eyes to steady myself. I recalled something the caretaker had once mentioned about people leaving early because they couldn't handle the stillness. However, my experience was not mere stillness. It was an active, oppressive force. Before locking up, I stood in the living area for a long moment, gazing at the dusty bookshelf and the table where I'd been working. The shutters were open, allowing in a dull gray light that flickered across the floorboards. I realized I was holding my breath. A persistent thought nagged at the back of my mind. Perhaps the footsteps on the roof were only the beginning of something more insidious, something that thrived on seclusion and fear. The caretaker's cryptic tone echoed in my ears. He had never specified what exactly made people leave the cabin ahead of schedule. He had only hinted that the quiet here was unlike any other. As I finally stepped onto the porch, I scanned the tree line. One last time, the drizzle had lessened and the forest looked ghostly, the damp trunks glistening in the pale light. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched from the treetops. My stomach chet again, then came a subtle sound, an almost imperceptible shift, like the weight of a body rebalancing on wet timber. I looked at the roof's edge, but saw nothing. Yet my heart raced, and my breath caught in my throat. A part of me considered climbing up there again, if only to prove that I wasn't losing my mind, but my hands trembled so violently that I couldn't gather the courage. The sense of an unseen observer was overpowering, an indescribable awareness pressing down on me from above. I hurried to my car, each footstep in the mud feeling heavier than the last. The moment I turned the key in the ignition, I felt a wave of relief, albeit tinged with lingering dread. My reflection in the rearview mirror startled me. My eyes were bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. My skin was unnervingly pale. My lips were dry and cracked from the tension of the night before. I took a deep breath, fighting the tremor in my chest, then steered the car back down the winding path every so often. Often I glanced at the rearview mirror through the drizzle. The outline of the cabin disappeared among the trees like a memory dissolving into the landscape as I drove. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had settled onto the roof again. Watching me leave the forest on either side of the road felt unnaturally silent, save for the faint dripping of rain on leaves. It felt like I was escaping from a place where the boundaries between what's real and what lurks in the recesses of the mind had begun to blur. The caretaker's words replayed over and over in my head, though I had no proof that he knew anything more than he let on. But somehow it felt like he had expected my early departure. He had seen it happen before. Visitors unnerved by something intangible, something that defied explanation. Even now, safe at home, I often wake in the middle of the night, convinced I hear footsteps overhead. My heart drums frantically against my rib cage, and for an instant I'm back in that cabin alone, listening to deliberate steps across old rain-slicked tiles. Sometimes I get up to check my own roof, running my flashlight beam along the shingles from the upstairs window. Even though I know there's no one there, I cling to the logic that my urban roof is impossible to access from the outside without a ladder, yet the adrenaline spiked the sweaty palms and of the animal. It had vanished as completely as a stone dropped in the lake center that should have been the end. A strange encounter, perhaps fodder for conversation at next week's office lunch. But the following night, as I reached the halfway point of my first lap, that familiar prickling sensation returned to my neck. This time I didn't need to look to know the dog had returned, trailing at the same careful distance, its yellow eyes fixed on me with the same unsettling focus. Night after night, the pattern repeated with mechanical precision. The dog would appear at exactly the same spot, follow me for precisely 2 laps and vanish. When I tried to approach it, I began to notice details. It made no sound. When it walked left, no paw prints in the muddy sections of the path, and never once broke its gaze from me, even when a startled rabbit darted across our path. One night, the dog's eyes remained locked on mine, showing none of the predatory interest a normal canine would display after the first week. I tried changing my routine. I walked earlier, then later I reversed direction, going clockwise. Instead of counterclockwise, I even skipped 2 nights entirely. None of it mattered. The dog appeared at the same relative point in my walk, regardless of the time or direction, maintaining its silent vigil behind me. By the second week, sleep became elusive. I would lie awake replaying each encounter, searching for some explanation that would satisfy my increasingly frayed nerves. During daylight hours, I researched local folklore, looking for stories of ghostly animals or supernatural guardians associated with the lake. I found nothing unusual, just the standard small-town history of settlers and minor industrial development. I considered discussing the situation with friends, but something held me back. How could I explain the growing certainty that this wasn't just a stray dog, but something wearing the shape of one? How could I convey the weight of those amber eyes which seemed to see through flesh and bone to something deeper? I feared the concerned glances, the gentle suggestions that perhaps I should speak to someone professional, so I kept silent, carrying my dread like a stone in my gut last night. Everything changed. I had resigned myself to my shadow companion and was halfway through my second lap when a sharp pain lanced through my temple. The world tilted sideways and I stumbled to a nearby bench, gripping the armrest to steady myself. My vision blurred, then crystallized with unnatural clarity. The night around me seemed suddenly more vivid. Colors, deeper sounds, sharper. I could hear the minute lapping of water against the shore. 50 yards away could smell the distinct scent of pine sap from trees. I couldn't even see in the darkness. When I looked up, the dog stood directly before me. No longer maintaining its distance, it sat on its haunches just 3 feet away, those yellow eyes level with mine up close. I could see that its fur wasn't simply black, but seemed to shift and ripple like oil on water, occasionally revealing patterns that hurt my eyes to focus on my breath. Came in short, shallow gasps, sweat beaded on my forehead. Despite the cool night air, every instinct screamed for me to run, but my body remained frozen, pinned by that unwavering gaze. The dog tilted its head, an almost human gesture of curiosity. Then, with deliberate slowness, it opened its mouth. I expected teeth, rows of gleaming white daggers. Instead, I saw only darkness, a void so complete it seemed to pull at my consciousness like a vacuum. A voice filled my head. Though the dog's mouth made no sound, it wasn't speech as humans understand it, but rather concepts and images that assembled themselves into meaning. You see me now truly see my reality fractured. The pain in my temple intensified until I thought my skull would split through watering eyes. I looked down at my hands gripping the bench and saw with horror that my skin seemed to ripple and shift just like the dog's coat, momentarily revealing patterns beneath that belonged to no known anatomy. When I looked up again, the dog was gone. In its place stood my own reflection, cast somehow upon the night air like a projection on black glass, but not quite my reflection. The eyes that stared back at me glowed with the same amber light as the dog's. The apparition dissolved as quickly as it had formed, leaving me alone on the bench, shaking violently as my mind tried to process what I'd seen. I don't remember the drive home, only that I somehow found myself sitting on the edge of my bed at 3 a.m., still fully clothed, staring at my hands as if they belonged to someone else today. I called in sick to work. For the first time in 5 years, I've drawn all the blinds and locked every door and window in my apartment. The sunlight that manages to seep through seems too bright. Almost painful, ordinary sounds. The hum of the refrigerator water moving through pipes, the distant conversation of neighbors. Familiar pull toward Lake Evergreen. Not desire, but something more fundamental like gravity or tide. I know I should stay away, but with each passing minute the urge grows stronger, becoming almost physical in its demand. I've begun to notice other changes. Food tastes like ash in my mouth. My reflection in the mirror seems slightly delayed, moving a fraction of a second after I do. And sometimes just at the edge of my vision, I catch glimpses of my skin rippling like dark water. The sun will set in 20 minutes. My car keys sit on the table before me, and already I can feel my hand twitching toward them. I know I'll go to the lake tonight. I know the dog will be waiting. And I know with a certainty that terrifies me to my core that this time I won't be walking behind it. This time I'll be looking back with yellow eyes watching for someone else to follow. The scratching started 3 nights ago, faint at first, like fingernails dragging lightly across drywall. A sound so subtle I convinced myself it was the old Victorian house settling. Or perhaps mice in the walls, but mice don't leave notes and houses don't write warnings in handwriting. That looks like it belongs to someone who's forgotten how to hold a pen. I've lived alone in this house for almost 2 years. The home office became my sanctuary after the divorce, a place where I could rebuild my freelance writing career piece by piece. The cork bulletin board above my desk was nothing special, just a practical tool for organizing deadlines, pinning business cards, and keeping track of article ideas. Nothing remarkable until the first note appeared. It was a Tuesday morning when I saw it, a small yellow post-it note stuck among my orderly arrangement of reminders and to-do lists. At first I thought nothing of it, assuming I'd written it myself during a late-night work session and simply forgotten. But when I got close enough to read the scrolled message, "Don't forget about the shadows," an involuntary shiver ran down my spine. The handwriting wasn't mine, not even close. The letters were jagged, pressed deeply into the paper as if written with tremendous force, yet somehow still nearly illegible. I tore it down, immediately crumpled it in my palm. My hand trembled slightly as I tossed it into the wastebasket. A prank, I decided someone had been in my house. The realization should have terrified me, but instead I felt a flare of anger. I checked all the doors and windows, locked every one of them. I even examined the door frames and windowsills for signs of forced entry. Nothing the next morning. A new note awaited me. It's getting late. It read in the same disturbing handwriting. My throat constricted as I stared at it. I live alone. The doors were locked. The security system had been armed all night, yet somehow someone had entered my private space and left this message. I took photos of the note, its positioning on the board, even the pushpin holding it in place. I'm not sure why evidence, perhaps for whom I couldn't exactly go to the police with complaints about cryptic post-it notes. They'd think I was losing my mind sometimes. I wonder if they'd be right that night. I locked the office door before going to bed. I even wedged a chair under the door knob, feeling ridiculous, but desperate for some peace of mind. Sleep came reluctantly, my ears straining to catch any sound of movement in the house. When morning arrived, I approached the office with dread coiling in my stomach like a cold, heavy snake. The chair remained in place. The door was still locked. I used my key with shaking hands, pushed the door open, and felt my heart stutter in my chest. There in the center of the bulletin board was a new note. "I see you when you sleep." My legs nearly gave out. I stumbled to my desk chair and collapsed into it, my breathing shallow and rapid. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. My eyes darted to every corner, searching for some explanation, some sign of how this was happening. The windows were sealed shut. They had been since last winter when I'd caulked them closed to keep out the draft. There was no other entrance to the room except the door I'd just unlocked. I took the notes to a handwriting analyst, a former police specialist who now ran a private practice downtown. I told him they were for a story I was researching. He studied them through a magnifying glass, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is unusual," he said. Finally, he explained that the writing showed signs of severe distress or physical impairment, possibly written by someone with neurological damage or under extreme duress. When I asked if all 3 notes were written by the same person, his answer chilled me. Yes, but he hesitated. The most recent one shows deterioration, as if the condition is worsening. He pointed to where the pen had torn through the paper in places, how the letters became increasingly malformed. That night I installed a motion-activated camera in the office, positioned to capture the entire room, especially the bulletin board I set it to. Send alerts to my phone if it detected movement. Then I locked the door again, adding a new deadbolt. I'd purchased that afternoon. I even placed a thin line of talcum powder along the threshold, an old trick I'd read about in a detective novel. I barely slept, checking my phone every few minutes for alerts from the camera. None came. When dawn broke, I approached the office with a mixture of hope and dread. The powder line was undisturbed. The deadbolt was engaged. I unlocked the door with trembling hands. A new note waited for me. "The walls are too thin." The camera had captured nothing. The recording showed an empty room all night. The bulletin board clearly visible one moment. There was no note, and in the next frame there, it was as if it had materialized from thin air. I began to question my sanity. Was I writing these notes myself in some dissociative state? Was this some bizarre form of sleepwalking? I scheduled an appointment with my doctor, who referred me to a neurologist. The brain scan showed nothing abnormal, no evidence of seizures or other neurological issues that might explain blackouts or lost time. The notes continued to appear, each more disturbing than the last. I'm getting closer. "Can you feel me breathing soon? We'll meet each morning." I would find them pinned to my bulletin board. Despite increasingly elaborate security measures I installed, additional cameras, motion sensors, even a pressure mat under the carpet. Nothing ever triggered them. No one ever appeared on the footage yet. The notes kept coming. The lack of sleep began to take its toll. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My work suffered. I jumped at the slightest sounds. The house I once found so charming now felt like a prison. Or worse, like I was sharing it with something I couldn't see or understand. I began researching the history of the house. It was built in 1897, and records showed a succession of owners, none particularly noteworthy. No tragic deaths, no notorious crimes. The house had been empty for nearly 2 years before I purchased it. The previous owner, an elderly woman who had moved to a retirement community. I tracked her down, hoping for answers. Mrs. Keller was 93, her mind still sharp. Despite her frail body, when I mentioned the office, something flickered in her eyes. She admitted that she had used that room as a sewing room, and yes, she had experienced strange occurrences. Items moved the sensation of being watched, and once she said in a near whisper she had seen something, a figure just at the edge of her vision, standing in the corner where my desk now sits. She'd moved her sewing machine to another room after that and kept the door closed. My skin prickled with gooseflesh as she spoke. I asked if anyone had died in the house. She shook her head, but then paused, her rheumy eyes distant with memory. "No one had died there," she said. But the man who built the house had a brother who suffered from what they called nervous hysteria. In those days, he had been confined to that room during his episodes, which grew more frequent and severe over time. Eventually, he was committed to an asylum where he died. Some years later that night, I couldn't bring myself to return to the house. I checked into a hotel, desperate for a night of uninterrupted sleep. The next morning, I felt marginally better, clear-headed enough to form a plan I would confront whatever was happening head-on. If there was something supernatural at work, I would address it directly. If it was a mental health issue of my own, I would seek the appropriate help. I returned home in the late afternoon, my stomach knotting with anxiety as I unlocked the door. The house was quiet, seemingly unchanged. I went straight to the office, steeling myself for whatever new message might await me. The bulletin board was empty, every single note, memo, and business card had been removed. In the center, pinned with a single red push pin, was a larger sheet of paper. The familiar tortured handwriting covered it completely, the words crammed together, some written over others in a frenzied palimpsest. It took me several minutes to decipher the message. "I've been trying to warn you. They kept me here too. They are in the walls. They want what's inside you. They made me write things. I didn't mean they will do the same to you. Get out before you can't." As I stared at the message, trying to process its meaning, I became aware of a sound, that same faint scratching I'd been hearing at night. Only now it was coming from inside the wall, directly behind the bulletin board, and it was getting louder. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The scratching intensified, no longer resembling fingernails, but something harder, like metal scraping against wood and plaster. A hairline crack appeared in the wall, extending upward from behind the bulletin board. I didn't wait to see what would emerge. I ran from the room, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook so violently I could barely grab my car keys. I made it to my car and drove away with no destination in mind. Other than away from here, I'm writing this from another hotel room. My third in as many days I haven't been back to the house. I'm not sure I ever will. I've contacted a realtor about selling the property, though I haven't told her why. What could I possibly say? Last night I woke suddenly at 3:17 a.m., the same time I used to hear the scratching in my office walls. The hotel room was silent, but a familiar sensation of being watched crept over me. I turned on the lamp beside the bed. There on the hotel notepad on the nightstand was a message in that same tormented handwriting. "You can check out, but you can't leave me behind. I don't know what's following me or what it wants. I don't know if it's trying to help me or harm me, but I do know this. Wherever I go, it finds me, and its messages are getting longer, more coherent, as if it's getting stronger or closer or both. Sometimes in the deepest hours of the night, I think I catch glimpses of movement at the edges of my vision, a darkness that seems deeper than shadow, a subtle distortion of the air, and sometimes when I'm drifting on the edge of sleep, I swear I can hear breathing that isn't my own. I've started carrying a notebook with me if whatever is happening is truly beyond my control. If something is trying to communicate through me, I want to capture it, understand it. Maybe that's the writer in me still searching for a story, even in the midst of terror. Or maybe it's my way of maintaining some illusion of control. Either way, I've noticed something troubling. My handwriting has started to change just slightly at first. The angle of my letters, the pressure of my pen, but it's becoming more pronounced, more jagged, more desperate. More like the notes the first time I heard it rain lashed against my windows like desperate fingers trying to get in a slow, deliberate scraping sound. Not quite a drag, not quite a scratch. Moved across the ceiling above my head. 3 a.m. and sleep evaporated instantly, replaced by that primal alertness that comes when your body recognizes danger before your mind can rationalize it away. I lay frozen eyes fixed on the textured white surface above me, tracking the invisible path of whatever created that sound. It stopped directly over my bed. My penthouse apartment was supposed to be the crown jewel of the building. Nothing above you but the sky. The realtor had promised with rehearsed enthusiasm she'd conveniently omitted the small attic space that technically belonged to my neighbor's unit. An architectural quirk from when the building was reconfigured decades ago, a shared structure she'd later admitted when I pressed her after the closing, but nothing I needed to worry about, just a storage space that nobody used. Nobody except something that moved on rainy nights. After that first night, I convinced myself it was the building settling, or perhaps rodents seeking shelter from the storm. But rodents don't pace with the measured rhythm of footsteps. They don't stop and start again as if listening, and they certainly don't seem to respond when you call out, "Is someone there?" With a tremor in your voice that embarrasses you, even when alone. I'm not a man who scares easily. I've traveled to remote locations for my work as a photographer, spent nights alone in abandoned buildings to capture the perfect light at dawn. I understand the tricks the mind plays in darkness, but what happened in the weeks that followed tested the boundaries of rational explanation and my own grip on reality. The sounds established a pattern. They came most often during storms, but occasionally on clear nights. They always started around 3 a.m. and lasted anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 hours. Sometimes just the scraping, sometimes footsteps, and on the worst nights, a sound like something heavy being dragged across the floor back and forth, with agonizing slowness after 2 weeks of disrupted sleep and fraying nerves. I knocked on my neighbor's door. Marcus was a middle-aged accountant who looked perpetually exhausted when I mentioned the attic. His expression shifted subtly, a tightening around the eyes that suggested discomfort. He explained that he'd never used the space in the 7 years he'd lived there, just some old boxes from the previous owner that he'd never bothered to remove. Too much of a hassle to climb up there, he said, especially with his bad knee. I asked if I could take a look sometime, and he hesitated before agreeing. Though he warned me there was nothing to see, I left his apartment with the distinct impression he was hiding something, though I couldn't articulate what or why. That night the sounds were louder, more insistent, as if whatever dwelled above knew I was asking questions the next morning. Blur-eyed from another sleepless night, I contacted the building manager. Mr. Grayson was skeptical but professional, agreeing to inspect the attic space that afternoon. I waited anxiously in my apartment, listening to his footsteps above as he moved around. After 20 minutes, he descended and reported finding nothing unusual, just some old cardboard boxes, dust cobwebs, and some minor mold issues. He'd have someone address. I pressed him about the sounds. Describing in detail what I'd been hearing, his expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes made me think he wasn't telling me everything he suggested. Old buildings make strange noises, and the recent weather changes could be causing the structure to contract and expand before leaving. He asked if I was under any particular stress lately, if I was taking any medications that might cause auditory disturbances. The implication was clear: the problem was in my head, not my ceiling that night. The activity above reached a fever pitch. It started earlier than usual, just after midnight, and with an intensity I hadn't experienced before. The footsteps moved with purpose, circling, stopping, then rushing across the length of the attic. The scraping sound had developed a rhythm, 3 long drags followed by silence. Then repeated. My ceiling light flickered, though there was no storm, and for one terrifying moment I swore I saw the paint bulge downward, as if under pressure from above. I grabbed my phone and texted Mr. Grayson demanding another inspection. No response. I considered calling the police, but stopped myself. What would I tell them? That I was hearing scary noises, that my ceiling was breathing? They dismiss it as quickly as the building manager had. Sleep was impossible. I sat in my living room as far from the sounds as possible, researching the building's history on my laptop. The structure dated back to the 1920s, originally a hotel before being converted to apartments in the 1970s. A few minor mentions in local news over the decades. Renovations ownership changes a small fire in the East Wing in 1983, nothing suggesting tragedy or the kind of history that spawns ghost stories around 4 a.m. The noises suddenly stopped. The silence felt more threatening than the sounds had been. My apartment seemed to hold its breath. Then my phone chimed with a text from Mr. Grayson. "We'll check again tomorrow at 2 p.m. The next day passed in a haze of exhaustion and dread. By the time Mr. Grayson arrived precisely at 2 p.m., I'd convinced myself that whatever was happening had a rational explanation: water damage, structural issues, perhaps even Marcus sneaking up there for some reason. He didn't want to admit Mr. Grayson brought a maintenance worker with him this time, a younger man named Cal who carried a toolbox and looked distinctly uncomfortable. They disappeared through the access panel in the hallway outside Marcus's apartment. Marcus himself was at work, having left me a key to access the hallway entrance to the attic. Their inspection lasted longer, this time nearly an hour, when they finally emerged. Mr. Grayson looked troubled. He reported finding nothing out of the ordinary, though they'd done a more thorough check. Even moving the boxes to examine the entire space, Cal remained silent throughout, avoiding eye contact after Mr. Grayson left. I caught Cal in the hallway. When I pressed him for details, he reluctantly admitted that he'd felt something off about the attic, but couldn't explain what the temperature had dropped dramatically in one corner, and his flashlight had dimmed for no apparent reason. Before he could say more, his radio crackled with Mr. Grayson calling him to another task, and he hurried away with an apologetic shrug. That night I waited. The apartment felt different somehow, as if the space itself had become aware of me. The familiar corners and shadows of my home now seemed to conceal secrets. I positioned myself in the hallway with a clear view of my bedroom ceiling, armed with my phone's camera ready to record any disturbance. Hours passed in silence. By 3:30 a.m., my vigilance began to waver. Perhaps the inspections had solved whatever issue was causing the noises. Perhaps it had all been in my head. After all, I was about to retire to bed when the first scratch came, louder than ever before. A deliberate, angry sound like nails dragging across the ceiling. My phone was recording instantly, pointed upward as I moved slowly into the bedroom. The scratching continued, accompanied now by a distinct tapping pattern. 3 quick taps. Pause, 3 quick taps, I called out, demanding to know who was there. The tapping stopped immediately. What happened next defies explanation. A dark stain began to form on my ceiling, spreading outward from a central point like spilled ink blooming on paper. Not water damage, too dark, too purposeful in its movement. It formed a crude shape that, with mounting horror, I recognized as a handprint. Large, with elongated fingers pressed against the ceiling as if something on the other side was trying to push through. I backed away, still recording my breath. Coming in short, painful gasps, the stain continued to spread, forming a second handprint beside the first, then a third. The entire ceiling now appeared to sag slightly, the white paint cracking along the edges of. The dark mark's panic finally broke my paralysis. I rushed from the apartment. Not stopping until I reached the building's lobby, the night security guard looked up in surprise at my disheveled appearance. I showed him the recording hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. His expression changed from concern to confusion. The video showed nothing but my empty ceiling, unmarked and ordinary. I spent the remainder of the night in a 24-hour diner across the street, watching my building through the window as if expecting to see some external manifestation of the horror inside morning came with no answers. Only the crushing certainty that I couldn't return to my apartment alone. Desperation drove me to Marcus's door as soon as a reasonable hour arrived. When he answered, the dark circles under his eyes mirrored my own. Without preamble, I demanded to know what he knew about the attic. His initial denials crumbled under my insistence, and he finally invited me inside with the defeated air of a man unburdening a long-arid secret over coffee that neither of us touched. He confessed that he'd experienced similar disturbances when he first moved in. The previous owner had warned him never to enter the attic space, to pretend it didn't exist. Marcus had dismissed the warning until the noises began. His investigation had revealed nothing physical, but the activity had intensified dramatically afterward. Just as it had for me after weeks of escalating phenomena. He'd followed the previous owner's advice. He sealed the attic access in his apartment and never acknowledged the space again. The disturbances had eventually stopped. I asked why he hadn't warned me. His response was simple and chilling. He was afraid that speaking about it would make it start again for him. He believed that whatever was up there fed on attention and awareness. Investigate it, acknowledge it, fear it, and it grew stronger, ignore it completely, and it eventually moved on to someone else who would engage with it. The implication hung between us by ignoring it. He had redirected it toward me. My fury must have shown on my face because Marcus quickly added that he thought it was gone for good. The previous disturbances had happened years ago, and there had been 2 other tenants in my unit since then with no complaints. He'd assumed whatever had been there had moved on permanently. I left his apartment with no clear plan except the certainty that I couldn't continue. As things were, the prospect of another night under that ceiling filled me with dread. But the thought of abandoning my home to this intrusion sparked a different kind of anger. This was my space. Whatever was trying to drive me out had no right to it that evening. I set up cameras in every room. I placed audio recorders strategically throughout the apartment. I researched cleansing rituals from various traditions and performed a hodgepodge ceremony that would have made any serious practitioner cringe, burning sage, reciting protective prayers from 3 different religions, sprinkling salt in the corners. I didn't believe in any of it. Not really, but it gave me a sense of taking action rather than merely waiting for the next manifestation. As night deepened, I positioned myself in the center of my living room, surrounded by my technological and spiritual defenses. The weight stretched my nerves to breaking point, every normal house sound, the refrigerator humming, the heating system cycling on the faint traffic noise from the street below made me flinch. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m., then 2. Nothing happened. The silence felt like a taunt at precisely 3:17 a.m. Every light in my apartment flickered simultaneously. The temperature plummeted so rapidly, my breath clouded in front of me, and then the noises began not from above this time, but from everywhere at once. Scratching inside the walls, footsteps circling me, though I could see the empty floor whispers just below the threshold of comprehension. My recording equipment emitted high-pitched feedback, then died completely. The protective circle of salt I'd laid down remained undisturbed, but somehow I sensed a presence within it standing just behind me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck. I didn't turn around. Some primal instinct warned that seeing it would cross a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. Instead, I spoke to it directly, my voice steadier than I expected. "This is my home," I said simply. "You don't belong here." The air around me seemed to compress pressure, building in my ears. The whispers intensified, forming patterns that almost but not quite resolved into words. I continued speaking, focusing on the idea that had formed while talking with Marcus. This thing, whatever it was, fed on attention and fear. The more I investigated, the stronger it became. "I don't believe in you," I stated firmly. "I don't acknowledge you. You have no power here that I don't give you." The pressure increased until I thought my eardrums might rupture something cold. Brushed against my shoulder, a touch so light it might have been imagination, yet so distinct I had to stifle a scream. Still, I didn't turn. I kept my eyes fixed forward, repeating my denial of its existence, my rejection of its right to be in my space hours passed in this standoff. Dawn eventually lightened the windows, and with the first ray of sunlight, the presence receded. The apartment warmed gradually. My electronics remained dead, but the oppressive atmosphere had lifted in the weeks that followed. I developed a strange relationship with my home and what dwelled above it. I never acknowledged the sounds when they came. I never investigated further. I lived my life as if sharing space with something I refused to see, and it retreated to the periphery. The manifestations became less frequent, less intense, though never completely absent. I still hear it on rainy nights, that deliberate scraping across the ceiling, but I've claimed my territory through stubborn denial, carved out a tenuous coexistence based on mutual disregard. I don't know what lies in the space above, and I've made peace with never knowing some mysteries I've learned are safer, left unsolved. But sometimes in the moments between waking and sleep, I wonder if my strategy has truly worked or if it's simply biding its time. Growing stronger in the darkness, I refuse to illuminate, waiting for the moment my vigilance falters, and on the worst nights when the rain beats against my windows like desperate fingers trying to get in, I swear I can feel the ceiling watching me. There are moments when the veil between what we understand and what lurks beyond our comprehension thins to nearly nothing. I've come to learn that in those moments, sometimes things slip through, things that have no business being in our world, and once they find you, they never truly leave. My weekend retreat was supposed to be an escape, a small weathered cabin nestled in the dense woods of northern Michigan. Far enough from civilization that cell reception was a luxury rather than an expectation. I had purchased it 3 years ago after my divorce, seeking a place where the constant noise of city life couldn't reach me for 2 days. Each week I could pretend that my life hadn't fractured into before, and after that, anxiety didn't follow me like a shadow that Friday the forecast had called for light showers. What arrived instead was a biblical deluge. I had barely made it up the long dirt driveway before the rain transformed it into a muddy river. Thunder crashed overhead with such violence that I could feel it vibrating in my chest as I hurried inside. Groceries clutched against my body by dusk water streamed down the windows in sheets so thick they distorted the view of the pines outside, turning them into wavering, indistinct silhouettes. I had just finished preparing a simple dinner when the inevitable happened. A particularly vicious thunderclap followed by the sudden absence of electricity. I'm not a man who frightens easily growing up in a rural area. Power outages were common enough that I had developed a routine. I set aside my half-eaten meal and retrieved the emergency flashlight from the kitchen drawer, then located the heavier lantern I kept for such occasions. Its warm glow spread across the living room, casting long shadows that danced along the walls with each subtle movement. The rational part of my mind insisted I should read a book, perhaps even enjoy the ambiance of the storm, something about being forced to slow down to exist without the constant buzz of technology. But beneath that rational voice lurked another feeling, something primal and inexplicable, a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. I positioned myself on the worn leather couch facing the large picture window that dominated the western wall of the cabin. The lantern sat on the coffee table, illuminating my surroundings in a bubble of amber light, while leaving the corners of the room in murky darkness. Rain pounded against the roof with a fury that made conversation impossible. Even if I'd had someone to talk with instead, I let my mind wander, trying to focus on the manuscript I'd brought to review rather than the growing unease settling in my stomach. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I questioned whether I had seen anything at all. The heavy cotton curtain, forest green and thick enough to block the morning light when I wanted to sleep in, seemed to ripple just once. Just slightly. The movement was so minimal that had I blinked I would have missed it entirely. I lifted my gaze from the manuscript, focusing intently on the curtain for several long moments. Nothing happened. The fabric hung still, seemingly obedient to the laws of physics that dictated it shouldn't move without cause. I almost convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, the way the lantern's flame flickered and caused shadows to shift. Then it happened again, a deliberate movement as if something had brushed against it from the other side, not the violent billowing that would accompany a draft, but something more controlled, more intentional. My heartbeat quickened, the sudden rush of blood in my ears, nearly drowning out the rain. For a moment, I set the manuscript aside and leaned forward. Eyes locked on the curtain, the cabin was sealed tight against the storm. I had checked all the windows and doors upon arrival, a habit born from years of home ownership. There should be no breeze, no air current to explain the movement. "Hello," I called out. Feeling immediately foolish for doing so, the sound of my voice seemed swallowed by the darkness. Barely carrying beyond the lantern's glow, I stood legs stiff from sitting and approached the window with measured steps. The floorboards creaked beneath me, each sound amplified by the tension gripping my body. The lantern in my hand cast my elongated shadow before me, stretching up the wall and across the ceiling like some grotesque extension of myself. 3 feet from the window, I froze there. Visible against the fabric of the curtain was the unmistakable impression of something pressing against it. From the outside, a vague shape, formless and yet distinctly present. My mind raced through explanations: a branch blown against the house, an animal seeking shelter, perhaps even a person stranded in the storm. But deep down, I knew it was none of these things. Branches don't press deliberately against windows. Animals don't stand upright at that height. And people cast shadows with recognizable forms. This was something else entirely. My throat constricted, suddenly parched. Despite the humidity hanging in the air, the lantern trembled in my grasp, causing the shape behind the curtain to waver and shift in the unstable light. I forced myself to breathe, to take another step forward. Whatever was on the other side of that glass, I needed to see it to confirm or disprove the impossible thought taking root in my mind. With one swift motion, I yanked the curtain aside, thrusting the lantern forward to illuminate whatever waited outside. Nothing. The glass reflected my own face, back at me, pale and drawn with tension beyond it. Only the darkness and the relentless rain, each drop catching the light as it fell. No figure, no creature. Nothing that could have caused the impression I had so clearly seen. Moments before, I pressed my face closer to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to reduce the glare. The window was cold against my skin, the chills seeping into my bones as I scanned the darkness beyond. Nothing moved save for the rain, and the wind tossed branches, and yet as I began to pull away to attribute what I'd seen to an overactive imagination fueled by isolation and storm-induced anxiety, the curtain behind me fluttered again, this time more noticeably as if gently brushed by fingertips. I spun around, heart-hammering against my ribs with such force I feared they might crack. The curtain settled back into place, as innocuous as ever. But the sensation lingered, the absolute certainty that something had been there, watching me, something that had moved to stay behind me as I turned. My breathing came in short, shallow gasps, each one burning in my lungs as if I were inhaling ice. The lantern's flame dipped and swayed, responding to my trembling hands more than any draft sweat beaded along my hairline. Despite the chill that had settled into the cabin, I backed away from the window, unwilling to turn my back on it again. My mind cycled through explanations, each more desperate than the last. Perhaps the isolation was affecting me more than I realized. Perhaps I was more exhausted than I knew. Perhaps the storm was playing tricks with the air pressure, causing the curtains to move in ways that defied explanation. But none of these thoughts could explain away the feeling of being observed. Not just observed, studied, as if something was taking careful note of my reactions. My fear learning what made me tick. I retreated to the center of the room, placing the coffee table between myself and the window. A barrier so laughably inadequate that in any other circumstance I might have found it humorous, but there was nothing funny about the way my skin crawled with the sensation of unseen eyes. The hours that followed were an exercise in endurance. I maintained my vigil, refusing to look away from the window for more than seconds at a time. The curtain remained still, but the damage was done. Every shadow seemed to harbor movement just beyond my direct gaze. Every creak of the cabin's frame as it weathered the storm sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I contemplated leaving, driving back to the city, despite the treacherous conditions, but the thought of stepping outside, of being exposed to whatever might be lurking in the darkness, was even more terrifying than remaining inside. At least here, walls separated me from whatever had been peering in, or so I told myself. As the night wore on, my fear took on a new dimension. Not just of what might be outside, but of what might already be inside with me. I found myself checking over my shoulder with increasing frequency, scanning the darkened corners of the room where the lantern's light couldn't quite reach my mind. Conjured images of pale figures standing just beyond the boundary of light, watching and waiting. By the time the first hint of dawn brightened the eastern sky, I had cataloged every sound the cabin could make, the specific groan of the roof as the temperature changed, the hollow tap of rain finding its way down the chimney to the closed damper below, the subtle scratch of tree branches against the siding, and one sound I couldn't identify, a soft rhythmic sound like breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When full daylight finally arrived, I performed a thorough inspection of the cabin's exterior. The ground beneath the window was a muddy mess, but devoid of footprints or any sign that something had stood there. The window itself was intact, the lock secure. Nothing in the physical world could explain what I had experienced. I left earlier than planned that Sunday, unable to face another night in the cabin. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the retreating structure for just an instant. I could have sworn I saw movement at the window, a shifting of the curtain pulled aside by an unseen hand. I haven't returned to the cabin since that weekend, though. I can't bring myself to sell it either. Sometimes I consider having someone else go there to see if they experience anything unusual, but I never follow through. What if they don't? What if whatever was there only shows itself to me? Or worse, what if it follows them back? Most troubling of all is what happens some nights as I'm falling asleep in my city apartment with the comforting sounds of traffic and neighbors all around me. Just as consciousness begins to slip away, I become aware of a presence, something standing in the corner of my bedroom watching. And though my eyes detect nothing when I jerk awake, I can't shake the sensation that lingers, the distinct feeling of fabric moving against my skin like a curtain being slowly drawn back. The air in room 307 felt wrong from the moment I stepped through the threshold. Not stale or musty as one might expect from a 200-year-old colonial hotel, but somehow expectant, as if the room itself had been waiting for me. The ornate brass key felt unnaturally cold against my palm as I locked the door behind me, the mechanism engaging with a deep, satisfied click that echoed against the high ceiling. I dismissed the prickling sensation across the back of my neck as travel fatigue. After all, I'd chosen this place, the historic Blackwood Hotel, precisely for its antiquated charm and connection to the past. What I couldn't have known was how intimately that past would soon connect with me. The afternoon sunlight filtered through heavy damask curtains, casting the room in a deceptively warm glow. Antique furniture gleamed with layers of polish accumulated over generations. A four-poster bed with an imposing mahogany headboard, a writing desk positioned beneath the window. Overlooking the cobblestone street, a tall wardrobe with a mirror that reflected the room at a slightly odd angle. Everything appeared meticulously preserved, like a museum exhibit one could sleep in. I unpacked methodically, arranging my clothes in the wardrobe, placing my laptop on the desk and setting my phone to charge on the nightstand. The hotel manager had proudly informed me that they had modernized just enough to provide electrical outlets and Wi-Fi while maintaining the building's historical integrity. As day faded into evening, I returned from exploring the town's historic district, my camera filled with shots of colonial architecture and my notebook scrolled with observations for my travel blog. Exhaustion settled into my bones as I showered in the surprisingly modern bathroom annexed to the antique bedroom. By the time I emerged, steam billowing around me, twilight had nearly completed its transition to night. That's when I first noticed it, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The temperature had dropped several degrees, enough to raise goosebumps across my still damp skin. I adjusted the ancient radiator, but it was already hissing and clanking at full capacity, shrugging into a sweater. I attributed the chill to the building's age and poor insulation. The first night I was half asleep when the whispering began. At first I mistook it for the normal sounds of an old building settling, or perhaps other guests moving in the hallway, but as my consciousness hovered in that liminal space between wakefulness and dreams, the sounds crystallized into something more deliberate. Hushed voices engaged in urgent conversation. Just below the threshold of comprehension, my eyes snapped open, pulse quickening, but the room remained empty. The digital clock on my phone read 3:17 a.m. Forcing myself to sit up, I switched on the bedside lamp. The whispers ceased. Immediately, my breath came in shallow bursts as I scanned every corner of the room. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet everything felt different. The mirror on the wardrobe now reflected a room that appeared longer, darker at its edges than the actual space. Warranted, the pattern in the wallpaper seemed to have shifted slightly, revealing subtle shapes that resembled faces in profile. I blinked hard and the distortions vanished. Must be jet lag playing tricks on my perception. I reasoned, though I'd only traveled 2 time zones east. I spent the remainder of that night with the lamp on, pretending to read. While my peripheral vision constantly monitored the room's darkest corners, the hotel staff noticed nothing unusual about my haggarded appearance at breakfast when I casually inquired about room 307's history. The elderly waitress's hand trembled slightly as she refilled my coffee in a carefully neutral tone. She suggested I speak with the manager if I had any concerns about my accommodations. Her avoidance only intensified my curiosity. That afternoon, I researched the Blackwood Hotel between visits to local landmarks. The building had indeed witnessed its share of history. Originally a merchant's mansion during colonial times, later converted to a hospital during a regional conflict, and finally reimagined as a luxury hotel. In the 1920s, newspaper archives mentioned renovations, ownership changes, and visiting dignitaries, but nothing that explained the atmosphere in my room yet. As I scrolled through decades of information, a pattern emerged. Vague references to incidents and disturbances in the hotel's East Wing. Where my room was located, several guests had apparently checked out early, foregoing refunds, their reasons diplomatically omitted from the record. The second night I returned to my room, determined to approach any unusual occurrences with rational skepticism. I left my laptop recording audio while I pretended to sleep, the desk lamp providing minimal illumination. My heart thudded against my ribcage as darkness thickened around me. The temperature plummeted precisely at midnight. This time I remained perfectly still, eyes closed but senses hyper-alert. The transformation happened gradually. First came the shift in air pressure, a heaviness that made my ears pop. Then the scent changed. The clean lemon polish smell replaced by something earthier, medicinal. When the whispers started, I focused intently on them without betraying my wakefulness, though still largely unintelligible. Certain phrases began to penetrate the murmured chorus, never found justice, buried beneath. Must be revealed, a floorboard creaked near the foot of my bed. Sweat beaded across my forehead despite the cold, but I maintained my facade of sleep. Someone moved around the room with deliberate steps. The mirror on the wardrobe rattled ever so slightly. Pages rustled on the desk where I'd left my notebook. My muscles tensed with the effort of remaining motionless when every instinct screamed for flight. Then came the sensation of breath against my ear, carrying words that froze the blood in my veins. Help us reveal the truth. My control shattered. I bolted upright, gasping for air that suddenly seemed too thin. The room appeared empty, yet fundamentally altered. The walls had receded, the ceiling heightened, transforming the space into something closer to a hospital ward than a hotel room. Shadowy figures occupied the periphery of my vision, but when I turned to confront them directly, they dissolved into the darkened corners. My laptop had stopped recording, its battery inexplicably drained. My phone showed only static when I attempted to take photos. Heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal seeking escape, I grabbed my key and fled into the hallway. There the world returned to normal, warm lights, solid walls, the distant sound of the night clerk watching television in the lobby. I spent the remainder of the night dozing fitfully in a leather armchair near the front desk, claiming insomnia when questioned. The third day I approached the hotel's archives with newfound determination. The manager, perhaps concerned about potential negative reviews, granted me access to their historical records under the pretext of research for my travel blog. Hours of sifting through yellowed papers revealed the first concrete clue during its time as a hospital. A particular doctor had been accused of experimental treatments on patients, though never formally charged. He disappeared suddenly along with evidence that might have implicated him. The hospital wing was hastily converted to hotel rooms shortly thereafter. Room 307. My room had been his office that evening. I returned with purpose. I rearranged the furniture to its original configuration according to a floor plan. I discovered in the archives, I placed my notebook open on the desk pen beside it. Then I waited for nightfall, no longer afraid, but electrified with anticipation. The transformation began precisely at midnight. My skin prickled as the air thickened and the whispers commenced. This time I spoke directly into the darkened room. I know what happened here. I want to help reveal the truth. The temperature dropped so rapidly that my breath clouded before me. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a single urgent voice. The shadowy figures materialized more distinctly now. Patients in outdated hospital attire, their forms translucent but unmistakable. My heart raced not with terror, but with adrenaline, as the pen on the desk rose and began to move across the paper of its own accord, coordinates, dates, names. My hand trembled as I reached for the notebook, the writing continuing around my fingers. The information detailed the location of patient records and evidence of malpractice that had been concealed within the building's walls during renovations. As the last word was written, the pen dropped. The figures gathered around me, their expressions shifting from desperation to something approaching peace. The room temperature gradually normalized, the shadows receded by dawn. I was alone again in a perfectly ordinary hotel room. I spent my final day in town locating the hidden cache of documents exactly where indicated, concealed in a forgotten maintenance space between walls. Working with a local historian and the reluctant but ultimately cooperative hotel management, we extracted crumbling patient records and a doctor's journal that confirmed decades of suspicions and rumors. The historian wept as she read accounts that would finally bring closure to numerous local families whose relatives had seemingly vanished from the hospital's records. As I checked out of the Blackwood Hotel, the manager avoided my gaze but ensured me that my stay would be complimentary. I declined, insisting on paying the full amount, something about maintaining the proper balance of exchanges that night in a different hotel across town. I dreamt of room 307 in the dream. Sunlight streamed through open curtains, illuminating an empty space devoid of shadows. The whispers had been replaced by silence. Not the tense, expectant quiet of my first night, but the peaceful absence of sound that comes when long-held secrets have finally been spoken aloud. I still checked the local newspaper website occasionally last month. They ran a feature on the formal memorial service held for the hospital patients now properly identified and acknowledged. Room 307 at the Blackwood Hotel has been converted to a small historical exhibit about the building's past. The article noted that guests and staff report the East Wing feels lighter, somehow as if a weight has been lifted from the very foundations they're right. Of course, some burdens can only be released when the truth is unearthed and acknowledged. Some spaces can only be cleansed when justice, however delayed, is finally served. As for me, I've developed a particular sensitivity to historic accommodations, a knack for sensing when the past isn't quite willing to remain behind thick walls and beneath fresh coats of paint. There are more truths waiting to be revealed, more silenced voices seeking the right listener, and now I know exactly how to hear them. The forest has a way of speaking to you when you're alone, not in words, but in the language of creaking branches and rustling leaves. I should know I'm a scientist, a man of reason and empirical evidence, yet here I am huddled in the corner of a decaying cabin, miles from civilization, watching shadows dance across warped floorboards as something scratches at the walls outside, something that knows my name. 3 days ago, I entered the Blackwood Forest Preserve with nothing but my research equipment and enough supplies for a week-long expedition. The university had finally approved my grant to study the rare Myotis obscurus, a species of bat thought extinct for decades, until trail cameras captured a blurry image. 6 months ago, this discovery could cement my reputation in the field of conservation biology. Worth the risk of going alone, I told myself no one else was available on such short notice, and the mating season would end. Soon the initial hike went smoothly. I cataloged specimens, recorded ambient sounds for later analysis, and tracked animal movements with practice efficiency. The forest grew denser as I ventured deeper, the canopy above gradually blocking out the sky until only occasional spears of sunlight penetrated the gloom. My GPS signal, weak in cell service, had disappeared hours earlier. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered overhead and the temperature dropped precipitously. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies, but mountain weather is notoriously unpredictable. As the first fat raindrops splashed against my face, I consulted my topographical map. The nearest ranger station was 15 miles back, but my field notes indicated an old fire road 2 miles ahead that might offer shelter. Thunder rumbled in the distance as I quickened my pace. The rain intensified, transforming from gentle pattern to driving sheets. Within minutes through the downpour, I spotted a shape among the trees, angular and artificial against the organic curves of nature. A cabin, weathered gray and almost consumed by undergrowth, stood in a small clearing. Providence, I thought, or so it seemed. The door hung partially open. Swollen from moisture and age, my flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a single-room interior. Dust covered everything: a small table, a chair, a cast-iron stove, and a narrow cot against the far wall. No signs of recent habitation. The roof appeared intact. Despite the cabin's overall dilapidation, I called out a greeting, half from scientific caution, half from primal instinct. Only the echo of my voice returned. I set up camp inside, grateful for the solid walls between me and the worsening storm. After a meager dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, I organized my notes and prepared my equipment for the next day. The rain continued drumming against the roof with hypnotic persistence. I checked the door, secured with a simple wooden bar that slid across metal brackets, before settling onto the cot with my sleeping bag. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. The first sound that woke me was subtle, a light scratching against the exterior wall near my head, probably branches blown by the wind, I reasoned, or perhaps small animals seeking shelter from the storm. I rolled over and drifted back to sleep. The second disturbance came hours later. 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced on the cabin door. My eyes snapped open. The rain had stopped, leaving a silence, broken only by the dripping of water from the eaves. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement outside. Nothing, just as I convinced myself I'd dreamed it. The knocks repeated: 1, 2, 3. "Hello?" I called, voice cracking from sleep and unease. "Is someone there?" No response. I fumbled for my flashlight and swept its beam across the room. Everything remained exactly as I'd left it. The door bar was still in place. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m., the witching hour, as my grandmother would have called it. I told myself it was likely a forest ranger, though I hadn't registered my specific location with the Park Service, or perhaps another researcher. I'd seen no evidence of camps or other expeditions. The third possibility, local hunters or transients, seemed most plausible if unwelcome. I decided against opening the door. Instead, I called out that I was conducting authorized research and would appreciate being left alone until morning. The knocking stopped. I lay awake for another hour, listening to the natural sounds of the forest gradually resume. Finally, exhaustion overcame vigilance and I fell into troubled sleep. The dream began immediately. I stood in the clearing outside the cabin, but the forest had changed. The trees leaned inward, their branches elongated and twisted into impossible shapes. Their leaves whispered words just beyond comprehension. In the dream, I understood with perfect clarity that I was being watched, had been watched since the moment I entered the forest. I turned slowly, sensing a presence behind me. The dream forest pulsed with bioluminescence, casting everything in an ethereal blue glow. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, indistinct and shifting like smoke. It raised an appendage, not quite an arm, but something that served a similar purpose and pointed directly at me. "We have waited so long," the words weren't spoken. They appeared in my mind, accompanied by a sensation of cold pressure against my temples. "We need your voice." I woke gasping, sweat-soaked despite the cabin's chill. Dawn light filtered through the single dirty window. Birds chirped outside their ordinary sounds. Reassuring after the night's disturbances, I told myself it was just a stress dream, triggered by isolation and unfamiliar surroundings. As I prepared breakfast on my portable stove, I noticed something peculiar, a pattern of moisture on the window glass. Not random condensation, but what appeared to be deliberate markings dragged through the morning dew. From my angle, they resembled letters, though in no alphabet I recognized. I approached the window cautiously, camera in hand, to document the anomaly. As I drew closer, the pattern resolved into recognizable English. "Welcome back." My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't told anyone about this specific location. No one knew where I was. More importantly, I'd never been here before. Scientific training kicked in, suppressing the initial surge of panic. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps previous researchers used this cabin regularly, and the message was left for someone else or local kids playing pranks on whoever might stumble upon the place. The message wasn't necessarily recent condensation, could have simply revealed older markings. I photographed the window, then wiped it clean with my sleeve. The forest outside looked perfectly ordinary in daylight. No twisted trees or bioluminescence, just mixed hardwoods and conifers stretching to the horizon. After a brief debate with myself, I decided to continue my research rather than retreat. The strange occurrences were unsettling but not threatening. Besides, the thought of admitting defeat to my department head over some unexplained noises and a possible prank was more frightening than spending another night in the cabin. I spent the day setting up recording equipment in promising locations and collecting environmental data. The work was absorbing enough that the previous night's events gradually receded in importance. By late afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself I'd overreacted. Then I found the marks. They circled the entire cabin, pressed into the soft ground approximately 2 feet from the foundation. Not footprints exactly, they were too narrow, too deep, with strange articulations that reminded me of insect appendages but scaled to impossible size. They formed a perfect perimeter as if something had paced methodically around the structure. Testing for weaknesses, I photographed them meticulously, placing my field notebook beside each impression for scale. The nearest impressions to the door were the deepest, as if whatever made them had stood there longest. Perhaps while knocking, the scientific part of my brain cataloged possibilities. Large woodland creatures, perhaps multiple animals, creating overlapping tracks or erosion patterns from the previous night's rainfall. But another part of me, a primitive instinct that predated scientific reasoning, recognized a deliberate pattern, a containment circle, a boundary. As daylight faded, I returned inside with growing apprehension. I reinforced the door bar with my tent poles and placed my heaviest equipment against the door. The window was too small for anything larger than a child to enter, but I covered it with my backpack frame. Nonetheless, night fell with unnatural swiftness. The forest sounds changed character, not quieting as nocturnal creatures replaced dural ones, but ceasing altogether. The silence pressed against my ears until I could hear my own heartbeat. Then it began again, soft scratching. At first circling the cabin with increasing speed, then knocking. Not just at the door this time, but at each wall in sequence. As if testing for response, I remained silent, documenting the phenomenon in my field journal with increasingly unsteady handwriting. 10:42 p.m. knocking pattern. Change now mimics human heartbeat. Rhythm 10:57 p.m. Temperature dropped 7 degrees in 15 minutes. Breath visible 11:16 p.m. Scratching sounds have pattern 3 short, 3 long, 3 short so's and Morse code. 11:44 p.m. voice-like sounds outside, not human language recording on phone. When I played back the recording, the sounds were barely audible beneath static, but what I could hear chilled me more than the rapidly dropping temperature. The noises had structure, cadence, rhythm, the unmistakable characteristics of language at midnight. Exactly everything stopped. The silence returned somehow heavier than before. I sat rigid on the edge of the cot, muscles aching from tension, ears straining for any sound. My scientific detachment had evaporated entirely, replaced by primitive fear. Sleep was impossible, yet somehow it took me. The dream was waiting. I stood again in the blue-tinged forest, but this time inside the cabin. The figure from before was pressed against the window. Its form more defined, it had a face, or rather a place where a face should be, with hollows that suggested eyes and a mouth. It pressed what might have been hands against the glass, leaving smears of phosphorescent material. You came back. You always come back in the dream. I found my voice. I've never been here before. Not in this body, not with these memories, but your pattern has been here. We recognize it. What are you? We are the caretakers, the collectors, the memory of the forest. What do you want from me to complete the circle, to finish what you started? The figure's form rippled momentarily, taking a shape that seemed horrifyingly familiar. My shape, but wrong proportions, distorted limbs, elongated eyes, too large and black. You left something with us now. We need your voice to finish it." I jerked awake, a scream trapped in my throat. My flashlight had died, leaving me in complete darkness. The air felt thick electric with potential energy. Something scraped against the roof. Not the random pattern of branches, but deliberate movement. Tracking back and forth, then a new sound dripping slow rhythmic drops hitting the floorboards beside my cot. I fumbled for my phone, activating its flashlight. The liquid pooling on the floor glowed with the same blue bioluminescence from my dream. It seeped through the ceiling in a perfect circle directly above where I lay as I watched it begin to form patterns. Not random splashes, but deliberate shapes that resembled the strange letters I'd seen on the window. My analytical mind desperately sought explanation, bioluminescent fungus perhaps, or some chemical reaction with rainwater. But I knew with bone-deep certainty that I was witnessing communication. Something intelligent wanted my attention. I backed away from the spreading puddle, retreating to the far corner of the cabin. The liquid continued to drip faster now, the patterns growing more complex in the glow. I noticed something I'd overlooked during my initial inspection of the cabin markings, carved into the floorboards radiating outward from the center of the room. Ancient symbols worn by time but still visible in the otherworldly light. The cabin wasn't abandoned, it was a waypoint, a meeting place. The dripping stopped abruptly in the sudden silence. I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice, the wooden bar across the door sliding slowly open. Moved by no human hand, I lunged forward, throwing my weight against the door just as it began to swing inward. Something pushed from the other side, not with the straightforward force of a physical body, but with pulsing pressure that seemed to come from multiple points simultaneously. "What do you want?" I shouted, voice cracking with terror. The pressure ceased so suddenly that I stumbled forward, nearly falling through the partially open door. Through the gap, I saw not the forest clearing, but a luminous blue tunnel stretching impossibly into the distance. At its far end, a figure approached the same shifting form from my dreams, but now with purpose and direction, I slammed the door shut and fumbled to replace the bar with trembling hands. My phone's flashlight flickered and died, plunging me back into darkness broken only by the blue glow of the liquid on the floor. The symbols carved into the floorboards now glowed with the same light. Creating a perfect circle around me, I recognized with sudden clarity that I had positioned myself exactly where whatever was outside wanted me to be. The knocking resumed, not random now, but a complex rhythm that resonated with the glowing symbols. Each impact sent vibrations through the cabin that I felt in my bones. The air thickened further until breathing became difficult. I closed my eyes, covering my ears to block out the increasingly synchronized pounding that came from all directions at once, but the voice found me anyway, bypassing my physical senses and emerging directly in my mind. "You began the work in another life, the research that bridged worlds. We have kept it safe, protected it, waiting for your pattern to return." Images flashed behind my closed eyelids, a man who both was and wasn't me, working by candlelight at the cabin's table, inscribing the very symbols that now surrounded me. The same man venturing into the forest at night following lights, similar to those I now saw disappearing into a luminous doorway promising to return. The doorway weakens the connection, fades. We need your voice to renew the bridge. My scientific mind fought against these impossibilities, but something deeper recognized truth in the images. A fragment of memory not my own, yet somehow familiar, surfaced the knowledge that what waited outside was neither malevolent nor benign, but simply other, ancient, patient, and terribly, terribly lonely. Dawn came with excruciating slowness as the first gray light filtered through the window. The pounding stopped, the blue glow faded from the symbols, and the liquid, which had dried to a crystalline residue. Only then did I realize I had been speaking no chanting words in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. When full daylight finally arrived, I gathered my equipment with shaking hands. Every instinct screamed to flee, to put this place and its impossibilities behind me. Yet the scientist in me, the seeker of knowledge, urged documentation. I photographed the dried residue, the symbols on the floor, the strange tracks outside that now formed a perfect circle around the cabin as I prepared to leave. I noticed my field journal open on the table, strange as I distinctly remembered packing it in my backpack on a blank page written in my own handwriting. But with subtle differences in formation was a message. The research continues across lifetimes. You will return when the stars align again. We will wait. I left the cabin and hiked out of the forest without looking back. My mind a battlefield between rational explanations and the undeniable evidence of my experiences. The forest remained ordinary in daylight. No blue glow, no twisted trees, no watching presence, but sometimes in the quietest moments. When I'm alone in my university office, I hear 3 distinct knocks evenly spaced on my door when I open it. No one is there, and in my dreams a blue pathway opens, leading back to that cabin where something ancient waits, patient and persistent for me to finish what I supposedly began. I've canceled my follow-up expedition. I've told colleagues it's due to inconclusive preliminary findings, but the truth is both simpler and more complex. Some doors once noticed can never truly be closed again, and some research once begun continues with or without the researcher's consent. I don't know if I'll ever return to that forest, but increasingly I'm certain the forest has never really left me the moment I stepped into the Blackwood Hotel. Something shifted in the air around me. A heaviness settled over my shoulders as if the century-old building itself was placing a cold hand upon me. The ornate lobby with its faded crimson carpets and brass fixtures whispered of bygone elegance, but beneath that veneer lay something rotten. I wouldn't recognize this feeling for what it was until later, a primal warning. The ancient part of my brain detecting a predator before my conscious mind could process the danger I was in. Burlington for a 3-day marketing conference, the kind of mandatory corporate event that normally fades from memory the moment you board the plane home. My company had booked rooms at this historic hotel downtown, citing its proximity to the convention center as the primary selling point. What they failed to mention was the building's oppressive atmosphere, the way shadows seemed to linger a beat too long in corners, or how sounds carried strangely through its narrow hallways after checking in. I noticed him for the first time. He stood by a leather armchair near the antique mailboxes, a bulky figure in a rumpled charcoal suit that hung awkwardly on his frame. The fabric appeared expensive but weathered, as if he'd been wearing it continuously for days. What struck me initially wasn't his disheveled appearance, but his unwavering stare while other guests milled about in the bustling reception area. His gaze remained fixed on me with unsettling intensity. I averted my eyes, chalking up my discomfort to travel fatigue. The desk clerk handed me my key, an actual metal key attached to a heavy brass number, not the plastic key cards I was accustomed to, and directed me toward the elevators as I wheeled my suitcase across the lobby. The hairs on my neck prickled without turning. I knew he was still watching. The elevator was an antique cage-style contraption with ornate ironwork and manual inner doors that had to be pulled shut. As I reached to close them, a thick-fingered hand shot through the gap. My stomach dropped as the rumpled suit man stepped in, standing closer than necessary in the spacious compartment. The doors clanged shut with finality. We ascended in silence, broken only by the mechanical groaning of ancient cables. His cologne, if you could call it that, was an odd mixture of mothballs and something metallic like old pennies. I pretended to check emails on my phone. Though reception was non-existent in the elevator shaft, from my peripheral vision I could see him staring, not even pretending to look elsewhere. When I glanced up, involuntarily his lips twitched into what might have been a smile but never reached his eyes. Flat gray and unnaturally still, the elevator indicator showed we were passing the 3rd floor when he finally spoke. Asking which floor I needed, his voice was surprisingly smooth for his rough appearance, with an accent I couldn't place. I replied curtly that I was on the 5th floor, immediately regretting sharing even this small detail. When the elevator shuttered to a stop at 5, he exited ahead of me despite not pressing any button himself. My chest tightened as he walked down the same corridor, his footsteps eerily synchronized with mine. The hallway stretched before us, narrower than modern building codes would allow, with yellowed sconces casting insufficient light over faded floral wallpaper. Each door we passed made the next seem farther away. The corridor stretching impossibly, my room was at the end. 503 as I approached, he remained just steps behind, fumbling with the key. I felt his presence like a physical weight pressing against my back. Though no part of him touched me, heat radiated from his body. In unnatural waves, I managed to slip inside and lock the door in one fluid motion, immediately engaging the deadbolt and chain through the door. I heard his footsteps pause, then slowly retreat. I remained frozen, listening until they faded entirely. Only then did I notice I'd been holding my breath, my shirt damp with sweat. Despite the room's chill, I told myself I was overreacting. Business travel often brought strange encounters with socially awkward individuals. Perhaps he was just another guest with poor boundaries. The explanation felt hollow even as I formed it. The room itself did little to ease my growing unease, furnished with heavy Victorian pieces that absorbed rather than reflected the meager light. It featured a 4-poster bed with a sagging mattress and windows that opened only partially, as if the building itself was reluctant to allow fresh air into its musty interior. The bathroom fixtures were original to the building. The clawfoot tub and pedestal sink might have been charming in daylight, but took on a more sinister quality in the flickering fluorescent light. Sleep came fitfully that night. The walls seemed to transmit every creak and groan of the old building several times. I jerked awake, convinced I'd heard my doorknob turning each time I found it secure, though the sensation of being watched persisted. Even with the curtains drawn, the next morning rationality returned with daylight. I attended my conference sessions, networking with colleagues and focusing on work by evening. I had almost convinced myself that stress and an unfamiliar environment had exaggerated a mundane encounter. That illusion shattered when I returned to the hotel. He was in the lobby again, seated this time. A newspaper held upside down in his hands, his eyes found mine immediately as if he'd been waiting. The newspaper lowered, revealing that same not-quite smile. My colleagues continued toward the hotel bar, but I made excuses and headed for the elevator, hoping to retreat to my room as the elevator doors began to close. A familiar hand slid through the gap. My heart hammered against my ribs as he entered, nodding as if we were old acquaintances. This time he didn't ask my floor, but pressed 5 himself. The ascending journey felt interminable. Sweat beaded at my temples. Despite the building's persistent chill, he positioned himself differently, this time directly beside me rather than behind, and spoke in that unnervingly smooth voice. He asked if I was enjoying my stay, if I found the hotel's history interesting. I gave non-committal responses, struggling to maintain composure. Then he mentioned something that sent ice through my veins. He knew I'd been at the Harrington presentation that afternoon. I hadn't mentioned the conference to him, let alone specific sessions. When the doors opened at 5, he gestured for me to exit. First, every instinct screamed to stay in the elevator to ride back down to the populated lobby, but fear of confrontation propelled me forward again. He followed this time as we walked the narrow corridor. He asked if I might be interested in discussing certain opportunities that could benefit someone with my expertise. His phrasing was vague, cloaked in corporate jargon, but underlying. It was something predatory at my door. I declined firmly and hurried inside, engaging all locks through the peephole. I watched him linger, staring at my door for nearly 5 minutes before departing. That night, I researched the hotel's history on my laptop. The Blackwood had stood since 1898, surviving fires, economic downturns, and numerous renovation attempts. Several pages mentioned its supposedly haunted reputation, standard fare for marketing historic properties. What caught my attention was a small article from 1976 describing how a traveling salesman had disappeared. After last being seen at the hotel, the piece mentioned police suspicion of an unidentified business associate who had allegedly been seen following the victim's sleep was impossible. After that, I pushed a heavy dresser against the door and kept the bathroom light on somewhere around 3 a.m. I heard shuffling in the hallway that stopped directly outside my room. The door doorknob turned gently, testing the lock. When it held, a soft scratching sound began, as if someone was running their fingernails lightly across the wood. It continued for several minutes before fading away. The third day of the conference passed in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. I kept seeing figures in rumpled suits at the periphery of my vision. Twice I excused myself from sessions to call the hotel's front desk inquiring about their security procedures and whether they could tell me anything about other guests on my floor. The clerk sounded puzzled, then concerned, eventually informing me that due to privacy policies they couldn't discuss other guests, but that security could escort me to my room if needed. I declined the escort, not wanting to appear irrational to colleagues, but decided to return to the hotel earlier than planned. Perhaps confronting this situation in daylight would dispel some of its power over me. That decision proved catastrophic. The hotel corridor was deserted when I exited the elevator at 5. Relief washed over me until I rounded the corner to the wing containing my room. There he stood leaning casually against the wall beside my door as if he belonged there. The corridor suddenly seemed both endless and confining. The walls pressing inward, my feet felt lean, each step requiring conscious effort when he saw me. That familiar, not quite smile spread across his face. His eyes, which I now noticed had an unusual reflective quality in certain light fixed on mine. He straightened his posture but didn't move from his position blocking access to my door. For the first time I noticed something else. No one else ever seemed to acknowledge his presence. No staff greeted him. No other guests nodded in passing. He existed in a bubble of isolation that now threatened to envelop me as well. He asked if I was finally ready to talk, his tone suggesting we had an appointment I'd been avoiding. My mouth went dry, pulse throbbing visibly in my wrists. I refused, attempting to move past him toward my door. He shifted slightly, not explicitly blocking me, but positioning himself so I would have to brush against him to pass. I chose retreat instead, backing away while maintaining eye contact, unwilling to turn my back on him. His expression didn't change as I retreated, but something flickered in those flat gray eyes. Something ancient and hungry that had nothing to do with business opportunities. I spent that night in the hotel bar, remaining in public spaces until exhaustion overtook fear. When I finally returned to my room well after midnight, the corridor was mercifully empty inside. However, something felt different. The air held a faint trace of that mothball and metal scent. The dresser I'd pushed against the door had been moved back to its original position. Nothing was missing but several items, my toiletry bag, conference materials. Even my pajamas had been rearranged just enough to notice I didn't sleep at first light. I packed my bags and went to the front desk to check out a day early. The clerk seemed unsurprised by my request but paused while processing it. She mentioned something odd. According to their records, I'd been upgraded to my room at the request of another guest, a business associate who had called ahead when I pressed for details. She checked the system again and appeared confused, saying she couldn't find any record of who had authorized the upgrade. As I waited for my receipt, a chill washed over me in the reflection of the brass bell on the counter. I saw him watching from the same spot by the mailboxes. When I turned, he raised his hand in a mocking salute outside. The taxi driver loaded my luggage while I kept glancing back at the hotel entrance as we pulled away. I looked up at the 5th floor from the street there, in the window of room 5. 03 stood a familiar silhouette, impossible since I just surrendered my key. More disturbing was the room adjacent to mine, where an identical figure stood in the window. Then a third appeared in another window, and a fourth. The taxi turned the corner. Breaking my line of sight, I never returned to Burlington, and I changed careers 6 months later. Sometimes in crowded places, airports, shopping malls, conference centers, I catch a glimpse of a rumpled suit in my peripheral vision, and in my dreams, endless hotel corridors stretch before me, each door opening to reveal the same smiling figure patiently waiting for me to be ready to talk. I know someday I'll run out of places to hide, and on that day I suspect I'll finally learn what he's been so eager to discuss the first time I heard the scratching. I convinced myself it was just the old oak branches scraping against the roof. The second time I blamed raccoons or squirrels that had found their way inside. By the third time, when the scratching transformed into a slow, deliberate dragging sound, Directly above my bedroom ceiling, I could no longer deny that something was living in my attic. Something that seemed to grow more restless with each passing full moon. I inherited this colonial-style house from my uncle. 6 months ago, the property sits isolated at the end of a winding rural road surrounded by dense woods that seem to devour the sunlight. Even on the brightest days, the realtor had casually mentioned that my uncle spent his final years as a recluse, refusing visitors and becoming increasingly paranoid. I should have paid more attention to the way her smile never reached her eyes when she handed me the keys, or how she hurriedly mentioned that the attic had been permanently sealed. For structural reasons, the first full moon after I moved in passed without incident. I was too busy unpacking, arranging furniture, and adapting to my new remote work setup to notice anything unusual. The house creaked and settled as old houses do, and I attributed the occasional odd sound to unfamiliar acoustics. It wasn't until the second full moon that the pattern began to emerge that night. I woke suddenly at 3:17 a.m., the digital clock's red numbers burning in the darkness. The scratching above me was methodical. 3 quick scrapes followed by a pause, then repeated. I grabbed my phone and recorded the sound, playing it back in the morning light. To confirm it wasn't just a dream, the recording captured it perfectly. Scrape, 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 pause, scrape, scrape, scrape. When I checked the astronomical calendar online later that day, I discovered it had been a full moon. By the third full moon, the scratching had evolved. Now it sounded like something heavy being dragged across the attic floor directly above my bedroom. The noise would start around midnight and continue intermittently until dawn, but something else had changed too. A smell began to permeate the house. Faint at first, but growing stronger as the night progressed. It was an odor I couldn't quite identify, like wet soil mixed with something metallic and organic, reminiscent of blood, but earthier, more primal. I spent that entire night wide awake, my heart hammering against my ribs as the dragging sounds traced what seemed to be deliberate patterns overhead when morning finally arrived. The noises ceased and the smell gradually dissipated until it was just a memory that made me question my own senses during daylight hours, rationality. Quality, as though someone out there just beyond sight was struggling to breathe. When the wind blew again, it carried the faint echo of that strained inhalation, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. The noise repeated itself intermittently, especially when the breeze died down. Each time it seemed slightly louder, a bit closer, until I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from calling out. Every nerve in my body told me it was a terrible idea to call into that darkness. Instead, I sat there pinned under a suffocating sense that something was out in the lake, inching toward us, only revealing its presence through those ghastly, labored exhalations. Marco stoked the fire, hoping the brighter flames might push away our unease, but the surge of light only made the shadows beyond its perimeter darker. My eyes strained to pierce that void, occasionally catching what I could have sworn were subtle movements. Near the water's surface, it was as if a hunched figure lingered at the boundary where the shore met the lake, its silhouette melting into the gloom. Whenever the flames flickered, my muscles twitched each time I thought I saw it. A jolt of electric fear snapping through me. I couldn't tell if I was imagining these shapes or if something truly shifted in the darkness. Sometime later, a gust of cold wind struck me with such force that I shivered violently. My teeth chattered and my shoulders tensed up as if preparing for an attack. That was when I grabbed my flashlight. In that moment, I decided I needed to see what was really there. Air to banish the illusions that were taking root in my mind. Switching it on, I pointed the beam across the surface of the lake. The pale light cut through the night, illuminating only the gentle rise and fall of dark water. No eyes reflected back, no creature emerged. Yet the sensation of being watched intensified, and the dull ache in my stomach grew into a knot of dread. My breathing became ragged the longer I searched. With the flashlight, I thought of shining it into the trees behind us, but a paralyzing fear held me back. A small part of me dreaded what I might find, or what might find me if I dared to look away from the water. Instead, I turned off the flashlight, letting the silence descend again. The moment the light disappeared, the sound returned, that wet, rattling inhalation that sent my heart into a gallop. We spent the rest of the night on edge, dozing off in short, fitful bursts, only to jolt awake when the noise crescendoed. Occasionally, I felt as if my own breath was in sync with that alien moan, as though something was drawing the air out of my lungs, forcing me to share its laborious respiration. Each time I closed my eyes, I imagined the lake surface parting to reveal a twisted face, lips parted in a toothless gasp. Sweat clung to my forehead despite the cold, and my clothes felt damp against my skin. Adding to my discomfort, my heart pounded so fiercely that it vibrated my ribs, and every shadow seemed to hide a set of eyes. A creeping doubt began to gnaw at my sanity. I caught myself wondering if it was all a hallucination, some manifestation of the stress I'd brought with me. Yet Marcos clearly heard the same sound, and the fact that we both experienced it lent a sinister weight to the entire night. Occasionally he would mention that maybe we should pack up and leave, but neither of us had the energy or courage to dismantle the tent in the middle of the darkness. We feared that if we turned our backs on the water, whatever lurked there might seize the opportunity to approach more boldly at around 4 in the morning. There was a fleeting moment of calm. The sound seemed to recede and the wind picked up again, rustling the trees and masking any faint echoes. My own breathing leveled out, though my throat felt raw from tension. I remember hoping that the first light of dawn would dispel this nightmare as I stared at the dying embers of our fire. I fought the overwhelming urge to run. The dread was a living thing slithering through my mind and feeding on every flicker of hope. When morning finally came, it arrived in half-light. Filtered through the haze of dense clouds, the relief I expected never fully materialized. Instead, I felt a numb exhaustion. My limbs trembled from fatigue and my eyes were gritty from lack of restful sleep. The lake looked less menacing in the dull morning gloom, yet I couldn't ignore the lingering heaviness in the pit of my stomach. As we cautiously moved closer to the shore, we noticed only old animal tracks in the muddy stretch, possibly deer or some other creature, yet none of these footprints explained the horrifying, human-like gasping. We'd heard my pulse quickened again as I inspected the area. The footprints were half-faded, suggesting they'd been made days earlier. There were no fresh marks, nothing that could account for the presence we had felt. I told Marcos that maybe the lake had some bizarre acoustic phenomenon, or maybe we had spooked ourselves into hearing things, but as I said it, the lake looked less menacing in the dull morning gloom, yet I couldn't ignore electromagnetic fields generated by living organisms. The description matched my experiences too closely to dismiss as coincidence. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing for the upcoming full moon. I installed motion-activated cameras in the attic and placed sound recorders at strategic locations. I researched protective measures mentioned in the online forums, lines of salt at thresholds, specific herbs known to repel negative entities, symbols of protection drawn in chalk. Half of me felt ridiculous. Taking these measures, the other half remembered the deep gouges in solid hardwood and the strange arrangement of objects in the circle. When the full moon finally arrived, I was ready, or so I thought. I sat in my makeshift command center in the spare bedroom, surrounded by monitors connected to the cameras. The local weather forecast had predicted cloudy skies, but as evening approached, the clouds dispersed as if deliberately making way for the moon's ascent. The first hours passed uneventfully. The monitors showed nothing but the still dust-filled attic. Then, as the moon reached its zenith around midnight, the temperature in the house plummeted. My breath formed visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The familiar odor returned stronger than ever, seeping into every corner of the house. On the monitors, I watched in horror as the dust on the attic floor began to swirl, forming a vortex at the center of the ritual circle. I discovered the cameras flickered, their digital displays distorting as if affected by some powerful electromagnetic field. Then, one by one, they went dark. The scratching began no longer above me, but throughout the house, as if whatever dwelled in the attic had expanded its territory. The sound emanated from inside the walls, under the floorboards, even from within the heating vents. My ears popped painfully as the air pressure in the house changed, becoming dense and difficult to breathe. I tried calling for help, but my phone showed no service. When I attempted to leave through the front door, the knob turned red hot in my grasp, searing my palm and sending me reeling back in pain. Every window had fogged over with a thick viscous condensation that no amount of wiping would clear. As I stood in the hallway paralyzed with indecision, the trap door to the attic slowly opened by itself. No creaking hinges this time, just a silent, deliberate movement that defied physics from the dark rectangular opening that fetid odor poured down like a waterfall of invisible miasma. Time seemed to distort as I watched the darkness at the opening. At first I saw nothing, but as my eyes adjusted, I detected movement. Not a solid form, but a rippling disturbance in the air like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. The disturbance expanded, flowing down from the attic like liquid shadow. My legs gave way and I collapsed against the wall, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The rippling darkness approached, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that seemed to freeze the marrow in my bones as it drew nearer. I began to discern a pattern within the distortion. Something almost like a face, if a face could be composed of constantly shifting smoke and shadow. What happened next remains fragmented in my memory. I recall running to my uncle's study, driven by some instinct I couldn't explain. The room had remained largely as he left it, with bookshelves lining the walls and his old desk dominating the center as the temperature continued to drop and the scratching sounds converged on the study door. I frantically searched the desk drawers. In the bottom drawer, I found a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my uncle's increasingly erratic handwriting. Flipping through it desperately, I found an entry dated exactly 15 years ago. During a full moon, my uncle had described discovering the same ritual circle I had found, but he had gone further. He had completed the ritual, thinking it would grant him communion with natural energies. Instead, it had created a bridge, a doorway for something that existed in the spaces between dimensions. The final pages contained his desperate solution, a counter-ritual that would bind the entity to the attic. Preventing it from fully manifesting, he had performed this binding during each full moon, sacrificing his own blood to strengthen the seal with his death. The binding had weakened with each lunar cycle as the study door began to bulge inward, the wood splintering under invisible pressure. I cut my palm with a letter opener and hurriedly performed the ritual. Described in the final pages, the words felt foreign on my tongue, ancient syllables that seemed to vibrate with their own power. The effect was immediate. The pressure in the room reversed, creating a vacuum that pulled the shadows back toward the attic. The temperature rose rapidly and the scratching sounds receded. I followed the retreating entity, my bleeding hand extended before me, continuing the chant as I forced it back up through the trapdoor. When it was finally contained, collapsed on the hallway floor, exhausted beyond measure. According to my uncle's journal, the binding would hold until the next full moon, when I would need to renew it. That was 4 lunar cycles ago each month. As the full moon approaches, I prepare the ritual components. Each month, the entity tests the boundaries of its prison, growing stronger, more intelligent in its attempts to break free. Sometimes I hear it speaking not in words, but in impressions that form thoughts in my mind. It makes promises, offers knowledge and power beyond human understanding. Last month, it showed me visions of what it could help me become. The images were seductive, offering evolution beyond my mortal form. For a moment, I considered accepting its offer, wondering if my uncle had originally intended to merge with it before losing his nerve. I now understand why my uncle became a recluse. This house cannot be abandoned. The binding is connected to the bloodline that performed it. If I leave, the entity will break free, seeking the one who imprisoned it, so I remain a jailer in my inherited prison. Tomorrow night brings another full moon. The scratch marks on the attic floor have begun to glow with a faint blue luminescence. The odor has started seeping through. Earlier than in previous months, I found new symbols carved into the undersides of furniture appearing when I'm not looking. I fear the binding is weakening, or perhaps the entity is evolving, finding new ways to influence our world. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I notice my eyes reflecting light oddly. Like an animal's in the dark, my teeth ache constantly as if shifting in my gums, and lately I've been wondering why I continue to fight. It would communion with such an entity be so terrible? My uncle feared it, but perhaps he lacked vision. Perhaps this is evolution calling tonight. As the moon rises, I will ascend to the attic once more. Whether I go as jailer or supplicant, I have not yet decided.